Thanks. Awesome to be here. I'm really excited for this. Excited to learn from you all too. So looking forward to the questions and me asking you questions. So yeah, I'm Daniel Mays from Frith Farm in Scarborough, Maine. So just south of Portland, 2 hours north of Boston. For those of you who live in New England. So it's a small farm. I'll give a little overview of it throughout this, but we're in zone 4B, so we get down to like minus 30 in the winter. So I'm a little nervous how relevant some of this will be for people farming in different zones, but I think there are a lot of principles that carry over across climates. So hopefully there'll be some good takeaways. So I'll just jump in. So this talk is supposed to be about 3 hours, and like Jesse said, there'll be a break. It's kind of 3 parts, and I'll stop after each part and try to save the questions till then, just because in my experience with a group so big, the questions can extend the presentation by a long time. So yeah, like I was saying, 3 parts, questions at the end of each part. If there's just a burning question to help clarify like what's happening on a slide that's really quick, feel free to yell that out. But otherwise, let's try and save them so I can bust through this. And we can actually get outside to Jesse's farm. So the first part, which I'll try and go through pretty quickly, since y'all are here already, you don't need to convert anybody. Sort of talk about tillage, some of my values, and then sort of the principles that guide our soil health practices. Then we'll get into the nuts and bolts. This is most of the presentation of the nitty gritty of how we actually do stuff. So then, yeah, talk about the nuts and bolts, and that's the bulk of the presentation. And then at the end, just kind of give an overview of some of the results. So the finances, but also the social and ecological successes, if you will, of this kind of farming as I see it. So jumping in, brief history of tillage on one slide. About 10,000 years ago, plus or minus, we humans started with the digging stick, just dig a hole to put a seed in. That's the beginning of agriculture, which in many ways is the beginning of the demise of the ecological planet. But we're gonna solve that, right? So yeah, from then we developed rudimentary hoes that were more effective at scraping the soil. Then we attached those to animals, 12,000 BC, and then the big breakthrough in technology was the steel plow, which enabled us to break through the prairies of this continent and really start to do a lot of work. And now today, or that looks like maybe the 80s, but we have just become really good at tillage. We've really mastered it. So what does this mean? So looking back through history at the legacy of tillage, these are some of the great civilizations of history: Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt. This is part of the Roman Empire in Palmyra. This is the Mali Empire. What do all these places have in common now?
They're gone.
They're deserts. So this was sort of a light bulb for me of oh, you mean these civilizations didn't decide to build their cities in the desert? No, they built them in nice lush places and converted them into desert. So that's kind of what we're doing now to this continent and across the world. This is that's the Dust Bowl from the 30s, where the wind erosion. We've got lots of pictures of erosion across the U.S. from just so much tillage, so much bare soil. So yeah, a civilization that destroys its own resource base is short-lived. So that's sort of what's at stake here. Let's try to shift, not even talking about climate change, just talking about the soil that we depend on. We're all terrestrial organisms, right? We need the soil to survive. So then if this is happening and we can look back through history and see it happening, then why do we keep doing it? Why do we even bother tilling when there are ways to do it without tilling? So these are all the reasons I could come up with. One reason is to kill sod or an established crop. That's a common reason to till. Or create a plantable seed bed, or to aerate and mix the soil, or to manage weeds. That's a common one for organic growers, or to break up compaction. Those are sort of the reasons I came up with why we till. We have all these implements that we've ingeniously engineered to do these things. I don't know much about them because I'm a human scale farmer, so we have a walk behind tractor, but that's about it. So yeah, there's plows, harrows, discs, rototillers, all these implements to perform these functions. But there are ways to do all these things without disturbing the soil. So for killing sod, we can mow the grass and then lay tarps to smother it, or we can sheet mulch right over it with different organic materials. To create a plantable seed bed, we can redefine what plantable means, and I'll talk about that. We just rake off debris from the beds to direct seed or transplant right into stubble. So the perfectly churned up, laser leveled bed that looks beautiful in photos isn't necessary to grow crops. And to aerate and mix the soil, we can just encourage the natural action of plant roots and soil organisms, right? It's a slow motion biological tillage instead of we need our instant gratification with our fast moving steel. For managing weeds, we can just, rather than constantly kill weeds over and over again, we can prevent weed germination by leaving the soil undisturbed or by covering it with mulches. Weeds are nature's response to a wound, right? Weeds are nature's band-aid because nature abhors bare soil. So rather than constantly ripping off that band-aid over and over again all season long, we can just try to heal that wound. So breaking up compaction, again, the slow motion action of roots and organisms will do that over time, and we can plant specific plants that have deep tap roots. And if it's really bad, we can broad fork to loosen up the soil. So there are all these benefits, and I'll blast through these because I know you guys are already here. You know the benefits, but the ecological benefits, so there's no damaging of the soil from fast-moving metal, which leaves the soil structure intact. There's no compaction from heavy machinery. This is no-till human scale as I'm describing. There's a third of the country, I think, or a third of the farmland in this country is no-till, but that's chemical no-till with machinery and everything else. That's not what I'm talking about, obviously. So yeah, no compaction from heavy machinery, which leads to less erosion from wind and rain, leaves the organic matter in the soil, sometimes referred to as carbon farming, seen as a solution to climate change. And all that organic matter in the soil increases the water holding capacity and drought tolerance, reduces irrigation needs, and just leads to a biological activity in the soil that reduces the need for fertilizer, is natural disease and pest control, everything. It's nature's model of soil health that doesn't require as many inputs and management. Economic benefits. This is often what convinces farmers more than anything else. There's fewer weeds. Just with making that simple decision not to till, you've just rendered irrelevant 90% of your wheat seed bank, right? You're not stirring up anything, so it's only those seeds in the top ½ inch to inch that are going to germinate ever again. So yeah, fewer weeds, and if you're mulching on top of that, then even those don't germinate. Earlier planting dates possible. You can literally just walk out into the field and start planting in the spring. Maybe you got to break some mulch off, but yeah, I'll talk about all that. You don't need to wait till it dries out enough to run a big tractor and implements through the field. There's closer spacing possible because you don't have to work around implement spacing. You don't have to leave space for wheels, tractor wheels. So a higher yield potential just from the geometry of the layout. Less time spent working the soil. For those of you who follow like the lean farm thinking, tillage adds no value to the crop, right? Tillage is muda, it's waste, it's a wasteful activity. Even if it weren't bad for the soil, it's not really gaining anything. It's not making the food taste better. So as beginning farmers too, that it removes all sorts of barriers. Choosing to go no-till because you don't need to invest in all the expensive tractors and implements. You can kind of start at a backyard garden scale. That's pretty much what I did, and then you can increase as needed according to your markets, without sort of going into crazy debt for all these implements and machinery. So yeah, just healthy soil leads to higher yields, fewer pests, less disease. So this is where we like to separate everything into little boxes, but so the economic benefits and ecological benefits are actually one and the same. This is a big one, I think, is all that time spent moving around irrigation. We use permanent irrigation. It lives in place, and you never have to move it out of the way because there's no implements going over it. So it's as simple as turning a single valve to water any part of the farm. We don't remove it for the winter or anything. It just lives there. So it's save all that time. And then there's the human benefits. Just of sometimes we forget in the scramble to make a buck as farmers. Like life is about quality of life. So the benefits of no-till farming in that regard are it just makes intuitive sense. I find even to customers, people who have a small backyard garden can walk onto the farm and understand what we're doing and take home information that's applicable to growing food at their level. So yeah, again, this is a human scale farming. That'll be sort of a theme of my talk. That the tools, practices, and enterprises are sized to celebrate the satisfaction of human work, and the work therefore benefits from the increased care that scale affords. So it feels less like work sometimes. Sometimes it's just like a bunch of humans playing out in the field. That's the goal anyway. And it's a more serene work environment. There's less noise, dust, exhaust fumes. We're not running engines all day. We're just out planting and harvesting by hand, which makes it a safer work environment, which again ties into the economic part. Your workers' liability is less. And when you have a really high ratio of humans to land, the work becomes social, because it's not just one person on a tractor anymore. It's a group of people working together toward a common goal. And I believe that humans will always be more versatile and adaptable than machines, even with all our artificial intelligence coming out. The human body is the most amazing tool that's evolved over the millennia to be adapted for agriculture. I find that physical work only becomes drudgery when it's done with not enough humans per acre. Done at too big a scale, that's when it becomes sort of monotonous and tiring. So yeah, human scale, which I keep talking about. This is Wendell quoting Wes Jackson. I think there is a ratio between farm size and farm hands that is correct. This kind of farming really maximizes that ratio of humans to per acre. We have we have 3 full-time people per acre of vegetables that we grow, and that enables us to grow a huge amount of food on that small area, and it enables us to have fun, ideally, in the process. I believe that humans want to be makers, not just doers. I believe that we will not find satisfaction in our work if all we're doing is operating a lever and pushing a button on an assembly line. We have a creative spirit, and by getting out into the soil and with our hands and feet on the ground, I think that satisfies some of that. Schumacher wrote "Small is Beautiful," and he has this idea that there's a tool and then there's a machine. A tool is something that enables or enriches our creative ability as humans, and a machine is something that replaces it. So trying to find that line is something I'm constantly thinking about with farming. This is human scale. We harvest in the wheelbarrows. We bunch things by hand. It's all, with the exception of the little walk-behind tractor for flail mowing and for initially forming the beds. We have a pickup truck to go to market. We have a small tractor to turn compost, but it never goes in the fields. So other than that, we're pretty much a human-powered farm, which might sound like going back to the dark ages, but hopefully I'll convince you that it doesn't have to be. So questioning tillage in the modern, in this century, has anyone read this book? 1 or 2, all right. Add it to your list if you're into no-till. This is kind of the beginning of the modern no-till movement. This was Edward Faulkner wrote it in 1943, and this gave rise to, this wasn't what he intended, but it gave rise to the sort of big no-till, industrial no-till movement that got co-opted by the chemical industry and is now sort of roundup farming. But his thesis of the book is basically there's nothing wrong with our soil except our interference with the natural provisions of growing plants. So basically, we don't need to till in order to grow plants. Like we can plant into what he calls a trashy surface, so a surface with lots of debris, and that's kind of the natural state that plants would grow in otherwise. But not to give him too much credit, because there are indigenous cultures around the world that have been engaged in no-till or low-till farming since the beginning of agriculture. So it's new and exciting movement right now because it's sort of applying to market gardening, but let's not give ourselves too much credit. Like, there's a lot to be learned from just looking at people who've been doing this a long time. There's the top left, I don't know how well you can see it, but that's the digging stick again, still being used that's in the Andes. And there's the Three Sisters planting that's still used at a commercial scale for growing, and just low-till sort of hand tool farming is there's a lot to learn from those who've been doing it a long time. So this is a value of mine that, or it's not mine, but it's a value I hold that if there's one thing we could do to create a better world, it would be to start thinking more holistically and less fragmented. So rather than, in the Western scientific world loves to compartmentalize into different topics, and in that it enables a lot of scientific, evolution, but we sometimes lose sight of the bigger picture, which is that everything is kind of one. Everything is all just, we got one planet here, and we're all part of it. The atoms that are us used to be something else, and there's no lines between things. So even when we say everything's interconnected, that's demonstrating our bias, because it's not interconnected, it's all one. interconnected implies it's separate things that have connections, but really we're all just one big ecosphere, as Wes Jackson says, one big organism called planet Earth. So if we could accept that, then all of a sudden, I think our perspective would shift on a lot of things. And in case anyone's like, oh, that's too woo-woo, that's not scientific, think about the human body, like we're the ultimate embodiment of individuality, right? Like I'm my own person, make my own decisions. But in my body, my cells are outnumbered by cells of other organisms by 10 to 1, just in my body. And if you zoom in on my skin, which seems like a boundary between me and the rest of the world, it's actually mostly air, space, and it's covered in other organisms. So yeah, just start to question when we start separating, even into like ecological, economic, social, like all those are human-created separations. There are no boundaries in nature. The whole is definitely greater than the sum of the parts, because the parts is a human invention. There is only the whole. So yeah, if we can start thinking of the world in terms of patterns and relationships, I think that will create a whole new perspective rather than things and individuals. So yeah, what does this actually mean? So another example. You can look at this picture. This is a pixelated image. Can anyone see what it is? Yeah, it's the Mona Lisa. But what we do as a modern culture is we take each pixel and we analyze it. We say, give all the specs of its color, its pigments. We separate them, we line them up according to, gradient. And we have all this very correct, detailed information that is totally irrelevant to this work of art that's sitting right in front of us. So if we can try to do that in farming as well. So this picture, I think there's a tendency among farmers to be like, oh, what species are those? Let's list all the species. Like, oh, let's test the soil. Let's like divide out all the chemicals in the soil and see where those levels are. Let's test the organic matter level. And none of that is wrong. Like that's all accurate and can be illuminating, but I think there's a lot to be gained from seeing the patterns of this image, which are, there's multi-tiered photosynthesis going on. There's a diversity of species with all interwoven roots growing in the same place. There's a whole spectrum of organic material from living to dead. You don't see any soil, right? There's no visible soil. Soil is fully protected. So those are some of the patterns. If we can start thinking in terms of patterns, which is hard because I feel like our whole culture and academic system is not built around that. So yeah, when we start doing that, it creates a humility. I think that we are just a insignificant part in this greater whole, and if we can recognize that, I think we can learn a lot from nature as model. We tend to think of nature as other. There's a human world and there's a natural world, right? And we need to protect the natural world from the humans. But really, nature is us. It's in us. We are nature, and let's embrace that. So this is nature as model. Nature's got it figured out, like how to grow plants, right? It's been doing it for a lot longer than we have. This is a tree growing out of a bare rock, right? It didn't require any fertilizer, didn't require any irrigation, pesticides, tractors, right? And that's a whole tree growing out of a rock. So let's try to emulate that as best we can. Again, this is nature at work, which might look like sort of a weedy, unkempt field, but in fact, this is a healthy, vibrant ecosystem that's photosynthesizing much more than any of our farms are. So what can we learn from that? How can we emulate this, but also make a living in today's world? That's kind of the challenge. So Fukuoka is a big inspiration for me. sort of, he called it do-nothing farming, but I think it's more like do as little as possible farming. You can't just do nothing and walk away, because not all the plants that grow are edible to humans. So we want to just steer it a little bit into, steer natural succession in an edible direction. So looking at nature as model, there's kind of these principles of soil care that come to mind. Number one, nature is really good at maximizing photosynthesis. As farmers, our job is pretty much to harvest the sun. So photosynthesis is that mechanism, and if we're not maximizing that, then we're missing out. We're not reaching our potential. Increasing biodiversity, when left to our own devices, nature will sort of continually increase the quantity and diversity of life of a given place. So ideally we could do that too as farmers. Aside from natural disasters, nature keeps the soil covered. So maybe we don't want to emulate natural disasters over and over again on a farm. Let's try to keep soil covered. And then also minimize the below ground disturbance to that soil ecosystem. So photosynthesis, going back to high school chemistry here, that's, you takes water, CO2, and sunlight, and it produces oxygen and food. This is the chemical equation of farming, right? This is what we do. But I think the flatness of our thinking limits our ability to harness all of, to maximize this. I used to think of farming as like solar panels. We're laying out solar panels on the soil. So from above, as long as everything looks green, then we've maximized photosynthesis, right? We've covered everything with green. But that's thinking just in terms of sunlight. But look at these other ingredients, CO2 and water. CO2 isn't coming like straight down from above. CO2 is in the air everywhere. So it's really the surface area of the plant that we're trying to maximize. And that surface area is in 3 dimensions. It's not just laid out flat on the ground like a solar panel. So this oak tree has about 5 square feet of footprint touching the soil, but 50,000 square feet of surface area. So I think we can go beyond. We can really push ourselves to maximize photosynthesis by maximizing the interaction between the plant and the air. It's kind of like the coral reef. All those little arms and stuff are absorbing nutrients from the water. I'll get into examples of this in practice, don't worry. And photosynthesis is so important because organic matter is much more than plant residues. This also took me a number of years to accept or learn. Adding all the compost in the world is great, but it's never going to replace living organic matter harnessed from the sun, pumped down into the earth, what Dr. Christine Jones calls the liquid carbon pathway, where that liquid carbon or carbohydrates and sugars, proteins are just pumped directly down by the plant into the soil and exchanged with microbes for nutrients. That underground barter system is what really fuels the life below the ground, much more than applications of mulch or compost or anything. So yeah, under healthy conditions, 40%, up to 40% of what is photosynthesized by that plant can be turned into stable humus via that process. So those microbes, digest those sugars and die, and the magic of underground life happens and leaves stable humus deep down in the soil. Whereas that plant, if it dies and decomposes, it's a much smaller percentage that remains in the soil. Most of it gets respirated back up into the atmosphere. So yeah, photosynthesis is just the key. Also, to climate change, right? It's like we talk about all these fancy ideas to how can we get carbon out of the air and stick it in the soil? Maybe we can use abandoned coal mines or something, pump it down there. Like, well, that machine has already been invented 4 billion years ago, right? The plant will do that for us. So, yeah, increasing diversity. This is the number 2 principle, I guess. Nature will, like I said, nature just increases the quantity and diversity of life if we let her. And when we nurture this web, it nurtures us in return. So what does diversity of life provide? It provides natural fertility to our plants. It provides natural disease resistance. Pest control makes plants that are more resistant to pests. It also cleans our air and water. It creates healthier, more nutrient-dense food, which leads to human health. So yeah, this is not just the health of the soil. This is the health of us, and I would argue of society at large. Starts with the little guys underground. Looking at diversity, this is nature's model. This is our roadside ditch that we did nothing to at all except not mow, and it has this amazing diversity of native perennials flowering. So yeah, look to wild spaces as the standard for what we should be shooting for as farming. And soil coverage. This also, I feel like I didn't fully appreciate. I sort of always heard that, like, oh yeah, keep the soil covered, that's good, otherwise it'll like compact a little bit over the winter or something. But soil coverage really is, a lack of coverage is what starts the erosion process. Even if you have flat land, even if you don't notice the erosion actively like flowing off your farm, like it's happening if your soil is bare. So this is a quote, which I'll read really quickly, sorry. Water falling as rain on bare soil dislodges silt and clay particles by its impact. These are taken into suspension and carried into the tiny pores and channels between the soil particles as the water makes its way downward. Very shortly, the filtering action of the soil causes the openings to be clogged by the particles. Water can no longer move downward through the soil, so it flows over the surface, carrying with it the dislodged silt and clay, and erosion is actively underway. Goes on to say, a protective layer of litter prevents this chain of events by absorbing the impact of falling drops of water. After the litter becomes soaked, excess water trickles gently into the soil surface. No soil particles are dislodged. The water remains clear, pores and channels remain open, and surface flow is eliminated. I think that summarizes it beautifully in this radical, cutting-edge quote from the USDA's 1938 yearbook. Yeah, so even just a single leaf on top of the soil will stop the suspension of those soil particles. So it doesn't take a foot of wood chips or leaf mulch or whatever. Just anything, or a blade of grass, whatever. Just keep that soil covered with whatever you can. Here's a sweet YouTube video to prove it. Can you see this? Maybe. So 2 canisters, one with just soil, one with soil with plants in it. Watering can on each. Oh, you really can't see it. Maybe you can. So the one without plants is already flowing and the water is brown. The one with plants hasn't even started draining yet. Can you see that at all? See that filling up with dirty water? This one's not even flowing yet. So yeah, this is what's happening below ground all the time if we leave our soil bare, or even above ground if it gets bad enough. You see those erosion channels. Once you see those erosion channels on the soil surface, your soil's already been eroded for a while, right? Because it's filled all that pore space down below. So yeah, this is soil is our livelihood. It's us. It's it's what we're made of, so let's try to save it. So yeah, mimicking nature's coverage. Nature often, or almost always, has like multiple layers of soil coverage. There's redundancies in place to really protect that resource. I think of the soil as like the internal organs of the earth, and the soil coverage is like the skin. So we wouldn't want our entrails hanging out, just like soil doesn't want to be bare. So there's the O horizon, which is the organic matter layer, the duff layer on top. That's kind of like the line of last defense for soil coverage. So I think as farmers that should be our bare minimum requirement for protecting the soil. So that could be crop residues or organic mulches that we add. After that, there's low-growing ground covers. So for instance, we could do undersown clover or some other low-growing plant. Then there's shorter plants. In the context of vegetables, that might be crops that prefer cool or partial shade, like salad greens. There's taller plants, like tomatoes, peas, Brussels sprouts. Then you get into shrubs. You can have berries or hazelnuts. Then there's understory trees, like fruit trees. And then your canopy trees, the nut trees. So if y'all are into permaculture, I think this is similar. They have similar discussion of layers. And this talk is about growing vegetables. So maybe we're not going to grow a whole lot of like oak trees in our vegetable fields. But I think this, if you look at a natural ecosystem at its best, it has all these layers in it. And so to the extent we can have more than just a single layer of one crop of vegetable, that will be increasing the soil health. I think it's possible to have 3 layers most of the time for growing vegetables. And certainly at least 1 layer at all times. So yeah, three's a crowd, right? This is the Three Sisters planting of corn, beans, and squash. And then lastly, nature's principle of minimizing disturbance. Really, farming requires some kind of disturbance, especially vegetable farming, right? We're not gonna create a self-sustaining ecosystem of vegetables. Vegetables are annuals, they're nature's band-aids. They require some kind of knocking back on this successional progression, since annuals are in here. Otherwise, fields grow up into shrubs and trees, and we'll end up with a much higher photosynthesizing state, but fewer vegetables. So it requires some disturbance. We need to impose our will on the land to some degree to grow vegetables. Which is why some people argue we shouldn't grow as many vegetables. But the goal, I think, is to apply the minimum disturbance necessary to achieve the desired successional response, which is to grow vegetables. So let's find that smallest disturbance necessary we can apply. Tillage is pretty overkill, in my opinion, for that. So these are common disturbance techniques for farmers. This is what I could think of anyway. We got sort of on the scale from harsh to mild. We've got rototill, plow, disc harrow. We've got your tilter, then the broad fork, then raking, and then you have your burning, flooding, mowing, tarping, sheet mulch, and crimping. And you can argue about what order those should actually be, but basically on the harsh end of the scale, we have fast-moving steel running through the soil. In the middle, we have slow-moving steel, kind of human-powered, broad fork and rake. And then on the right, we have disturbances that are pretty limited to above ground, without disturbing that soil ecosystem. So the harsh ones are mimicking earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, landslides. That's the only time that kind of soil disturbance happens in nature. Whereas the slow-moving steel, I think, is more like the action of burrowing animals or soil organisms. It's a more of a biological disturbance. And then on the top, or the more mild, above ground disturbances are mimicking wildfires, grazing, or just overstory shading, blocking the sun. Are you guys kind of with me on this stuff, or am I like, all right, sweet. We'll get to the actual farming soon. So again, nature's principles. If we can do these 4 things, I think we're doing pretty well, especially as vegetable farmers, because I think that's kind of like growing annuals is kind of like the harshest kind of farming there is. So yeah, these principles get translated into actual practices on the farm. Going no-till, so avoiding tillage, mulching with organic mulches, leaving crop residues in place, multi-cropping, so growing more than one crop on a bed at a time, also called interplanting, companion planting, undersowing, so all sort of terms for the same thing. Undersowing. Cover cropping, so growing crops that aren't for direct sale, but are just to feed the soil. And then integrating livestock, and then planting intentional sort of hedgerows for diversity. So these are the practices I'll get into in the next part, and those are the 4 principles there, and they all check off some of them. So we're trying to work toward nature's model as best we can, while still, earning a living in today's world.
You mentioned this lady that does liquid carbon pathways. Her name is something Jones.
Dr. Christine Jones. Yes, she's great. I think she's from Australia, great soil scientist. Another great one is Dr. Elaine Ingham. She speaks a similar language. Just really great scientific views of how important life in the soil is. I think a lot of us know that on an intuitive level, maybe even all of us know that on an intuitive level, but they're putting the science behind it too.
When you said that you aren't moving around irrigation at all, are you using overhead or drip?
Yeah, so the question was, if we're not moving irrigation, are we using overhead or drip? Mostly overhead. We use wobbler sprinklers, so micro sprinklers. We use drip just in the high tunnels on tomatoes and cucumbers, so we don't get the leaves wet.
Do you have a way of blowing it out before it freezes?
Yeah, we have a way of blowing it out. I've blown it out before, and I've also not blown it out, and I find as long as you open all the valves, very few crack. Usually none. And we get hard winters. Yeah.
Could you maybe go into your background and how you...
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. So my background is, where to start? I started farming with less than a season of experience. So for me, this was like kind of trial by fire, learn by doing. I started really small, like I mentioned, so I didn't have to start paying a giant loan payment right away. But before that, I studied math and physics in college. I went and taught high school math and physics for 2 years, which I love teaching, but I was young and footloose, so I left that, did a little bit of traveling, went to grad school for environmental engineering, and that's when I really realized what felt sustainable for me. I joked that I went to grad school to learn what I didn't want to do, which was computer analysis of energy efficiency modeling of buildings. I've always felt strongly about sort of sustainability, environmental activism. So yeah, sitting behind a computer analyzing corporate buildings for efficiency, wasn't quite doing it for me. So I had done some traveling, woofing, working on farms, and I started reading Wendell Berry, and that was sort of it for me. I was like, oh, this is actually what feels sustainable. So I helped start a little garden with some friends on one of their parents' land for a partial season, and I loved it so much, I was like, I'm just going for this. So I started looking for land and getting into the next section. Like, yeah, I bought land 9 years ago. Took out a loan. And yeah, you'll see what became of that.
I guess it's more of a nuts and bolts question, but sail seed beds and bare fallows, are those anything that you use at all in your rotation? Or do you see them?
No. So yes, stale seed bedding or bare fallow. Those are pretty much bare soil.
They are.
They are, yeah. I mean, I guess stale seed bedding, if you had compost on top, it's not quite bare. But yeah, those are practices. I feel like that sacrifice ecological health for a weed problem, pretty much, or some other problem. I feel like there are better solutions to deal with those problems than leaving the soil
Are you
bare.
going to get to those? Or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. I think if you do have a really big weed problem, you might have to make concessions in the short term. A lot of what I'm presenting here, I've been doing this 9 years, and we've kind of honed in on what works for us. So this is kind of the like glossy, like when it works, this is what it looks like. So I'm very aware of like, if you're starting with like horribly dead soil or compacted or full of weeds, this is going to take a while to build up to this. It's not like you just choose to go no-till and the next season you're like golden. So yeah, there might be some concession. Maybe you have to do some tillage to transition. Maybe you have to do like more tarping. Maybe you need to do stale seed bedding. I think I appreciate Jesse's emphasis on no dogma. Like this is the system that's worked for me and it's working, but that's not to say it has to work for everyone that same way. So yeah, I don't want to like poo-poo any practices. Although that one does feel like you're not hitting those principles of soil health, and maybe that's a choice you make in the short term to meet another goal. Yeah.
Would you say that your crop selection has like evolved or changed as you've developed your systems? Like, are there some kind of crops or ways of planting? Like potatoes might be a harder thing to grow and not be disturbing.
Yeah. So how has my crop selection been influenced by going no-till? Yeah, potatoes are one that I stopped growing because you basically have to till the bed by hand to harvest them. Although now I'm excited by Gabe Brown's method of just lay the potatoes on top and roll out some round bale of straw on top, and then you just rake off the straw to harvest. So finding straw is a little harder in my part of the country, but I'm hoping to do that next year. So yeah, potatoes, getting away from those. Otherwise, I don't think so. I think we've come up with different strategies for different crops to still grow that full array of, your market garden vegetables.
How thick of a layer of straw does it put on potatoes?
How thick a layer of straw does Gabe Brown put on? Anybody?
It's super thick. It has to be super thick. If you're going to do surface level potatoes and you don't have complete sun blockage, you're going to get green potatoes. We did it under compost, kind of as a trial this year, just probably about 6 inches. So slightly encrusted in the soil, completely covered with compost. For the most part, it worked, but we did have some greening, so it did have to be more than that. And with straw, I think you get a pretty good amount of water, but you need a fair amount.
Yeah, and that brings up another thing which I'll get into is you got to think ahead with that, because that's a huge amount of material that's going to be in the way of your next crop after potatoes. So like plan that into your crop plan, because I know I used straw on garlic one year, and then the next year I was going to grow carrots, and there was so much straw there I couldn't push the seeder through to get the carrots in, so I had to adjust. So that's worth thinking ahead on. Yeah.
One of the things that I have consistent issues with is sourcing materials that don't include, like compost that doesn't include biosludge, or in my case, we have a lot of straw in Georgia, but a lot of the straw has also been treated with Grazon and things like that, and other broadleaf herbicides.
Right.
So when I hear about people who are doing a lot of mulching with straw, what I'm hearing is they're growing their own straw and their own hay, and then they're mulching with that. But on a small scale, that's really helpful. So I think getting into some sourcing issues would be really helpful.
Totally. I think that's a great group discussion because she's talking about sourcing issues for these organic materials. I think that's a huge thing to start figuring out well in advance of when you need the material. And sourcing is going to vary so much by region. For instance, I have to reserve straw like a year in advance because we don't grow a lot of grain in New England.
We have a lot of straw.
Well, you have a lot of straw, but maybe it's poisons, right? So yeah, thinking ahead, I think that's that's not a sort of question I can answer. I think everybody kind of has to chime in on that. Like, how do you find these sources? I will talk a little bit about tapping into sort of waste streams of organic material, especially if you live in a populated area, because wherever humans and trees live in proximity, there's a lot of tree waste because we don't like it on our telephone poles or our lawns, and so yeah, there's wood chips and leaves, which can be great resources. But yeah, I guess one more comment on that is I'm a big advocate of staying super small. 3 people per acre. So if you're a one-person show, that's a third of an acre. That doesn't take a huge amount of material. You still need to find it, but it takes less than if you're trying to scale this up to 10 acres all of a sudden. Then I think I've found over the course of the farm's history, as I increased that human to acre ratio, we produced more per human and per acre. So it's a little bit of a mind twist, but yeah, we became more productive on every metric basically. Just by getting more intensive rather than more expansive. So that's a way to think about scaling up, scale up intensity-wise, maybe without prepping more acreage, and that will help with sourcing. Although you still got to find the materials. Cool. I guess I'll carry on. We'll get into the nuts and bolts.
I'm sorry. I want to make sure I'm clear about your statement.
Yes.
Which was getting more intensive. One of the things you did is you put more people on the land, which
Yes.
gave you more intense opportunity. You could put more mulch down. You could tend more plants. You could plant more plants.
Exactly.
You had more people on the land.
Exactly. I found that every chain is as strong as its weakest link. I found that weakest link for vegetable growing is very often human labor, even for mechanized farms. So by strengthening that link, we were able to produce just that much more. And that just means, it's more attention to every square foot on the farm. It's more, you're getting to weeds before they start competing. You're able to just tend things with more care. It's basically like backyard gardening, but at a commercial scale, where you can really pay attention to detail. So that's really worked for me, and it's just led to a more social, fun farming experience too. Not to say it's all roses, but and again, yeah, maybe that doesn't work for everybody based on your land and how you want to farm.
If it was all roses, I don't know, it would be any kale or collards. I don't know. I don't like that.
Yeah, no, we actually don't grow any roses. So I'm going to give an overview of the farm, so you have a little context. What I had to take out because the slideshow was too long was all the stuff about starting a farm, but it sounds like y'all are farmers already, so maybe that wasn't relevant anyway. Then I'll talk about our no-till permanent bed system, how we establish it, how we manage it, how we use mulches, how we use cover crops, how we integrate livestock, briefly talk about our crop plan, and then lots of examples of multi-cropping, interplanting, and then our beneficial plantings, or hedgerows. We call them beneficial beds. So Frith Farm overview. This is the farm 9 years ago, just before I bought it. It was an empty hayfield that had been hayed for a decade or more with nothing added back. I have pretty sandy soil. It's a loamy sand, so the organic matter is very low, nutrients very low, but tabletop flat. It had been mowed once a year, so it was grass, no brush. It's kind of a clean canvas, ready to farm. The house, on the other hand, was actually brought the value of the land down a little bit because it was condemnable. 4 feet of water in the basement, like black mold, lead paint, everything. So as I started farming, I also started renovating the house. I thought I was going to tear it down and live in a greenhouse while I built a house like years later. But it turns out even a falling down house was easier than trying to live in a greenhouse. So yeah, that was a big part of my starting the farm, was also starting to like renovate a house and learn all those skills of carpentry and plumbing, electrical, which I didn't have. So that was 9 years ago. This year. One of our CSA members brought out their drone, which was very exciting. So we got this overhead shot from an angle I never would have imagined. So we are 2.5 acres of vegetables, about another 2 acres of pasture. So the pasture kind of surrounds the whole farm, the fields. So the layers circle the pasture. Means we don't have any ticks because the layers de-tick the farm for us. So we have 9 seasonal employees. Annual revenue of about $300,000. I share that one so that you take me seriously. 4 months off a year, so we have pretty harsh winters, and we don't do much winter growing at all. So pretty much from late November until late March, we hibernate. And we still sell storage crops, and there's still chores and stuff, but it's a very different pace than the summer, which I imagine might be different down here when you can grow a lot more in the winter, even outside. So I started in 2011 with a $180,000 loan, 4% interest rate, and pretty much no other capital or experience. And I've never had an off-farm job. I'm not a good multitasker, so I wanted to just go all in with farming, and I think that enabled me to figure things out in a better way than I would have if I had outside income. So yeah, this is now, and between then and now, it's been a long journey. Those first couple of years where I was just hoping I could survive and farm again the next year. I'll get into the numbers a little bit later, but it was dicey financially. I was working every waking hour, like at least 16-hour days, and loving it. I was 26, but it wasn't sustainable, but it enabled the farm to establish and get to a point where now it does feel sustainable.
9 seasonal employees and you?
I guess that counted me.
Okay.
Yep. So 9 full-time people on less than 3 acres. Yeah, that's my 3-to-1 ratio. Yeah. And we have more people, more than 3-to-1, because we also have animals and pasture that we're managing. So yeah, getting into the permanent bed system. I imagine this is not new to many of you. So we do permanent raised beds. Raised beds are great for extra drainage and early warming in the spring, but those actually aren't the reasons I use them. The reason I use them is just so I know where to walk in the path, because otherwise everything would be flat and it would get confusing where to plant, where to walk. And I think raising the beds is simpler than trying to maintain like stakes and strings and stuff. And it does have that extra benefit of warming a little faster, draining in the spring, and being just a little bit closer to you so you don't bend over quite as far. So we have standardized bed dimensions. So our beds are 5 feet on center and 100 feet long. And we have we make sure to leave room for access at the head of each plot for if we do need to drive there, like a pickup truck for harvesting heavy things or spreading compost. There's always access on one end. On the other end, there might be a hedgerow. And then we also have hedgerows or beneficial beds, as I call them, between each plot. Again, that's as much as one of its purposes is a visual marker for where the one plot ends and the other begins. Also has all that benefit of bringing diversity into the fields. So yeah, here's our system, our layout. There's 16 plots. They all have 12 beds that are 100 feet long. Hedgerows separate almost every one, and then vehicle access at the head. So I think laying out the fields in this sort of very rectilinear, standardized way maybe doesn't feel very like permaculture or natural, but it does facilitate really easy modular like crop rotation. You can reuse tarps, row covers, irrigation, like everything is sized the same way. It makes record keeping really easy. 100 is a really easy number. Makes seed orders easy. And yeah, just having it all standardized means you can compare different plots year to year. And yeah, just keeping track of all the records is greatly simplified than if you had like triangular plots or all different sizes. And again, I was fortunate to have this tabletop flat land, all the same soil type. I totally get that might not be where you're farming. Maybe that's not possible to standardize so much. Cool, so that's the layout.
When you said 5-foot bed on centers, what's the bed dimension?
Oh yeah, thank you. So it's 5 feet on center, but I find however hard I try, otherwise the pads are always 18 inches. So that leaves 42 inches for the bed top, if you will. Yeah. I guess that's one argument for not raised beds is you don't lose that little bit of shoulder as it like slopes up to form the raised bed. But I just kind of treat that as part of the path. So establishing permanent raised beds, yeah, there's a few different ways to do it. However you do it, I think it's a great opportunity to ignore the title of this presentation and till it one last time. I call it one-time tillage to emphasize like this is a transitional, successional disturbance that then is going to establish a more permanent state of bed. So it also, the one-time tillage gives the opportunity to mix in compost, amendments, lime if you need it. It's a way to sort of jumpstart that soil biology faster than you could by, tarping and spreading compost on top or sheet mulching. So yeah, as hard as tillage is on the ground, to do it one last time to set up these permanent raised beds, I think is worth it. I'll talk about other ways to do it if you want to be a purist, but I think, one last tillage event is, especially if you need to start earning revenue, like it's the fastest way to get things going. This is compost spread on top of pasture. So I'm really taking advantage of that one-time opportunity. This is what 10 cubic yards per 1,000 square feet looks like. It basically covers all the grass. And this is before we're tilling. We till with the rotary plow on the BCS. So it's a very small scale, slow form of tillage, but it's definitely tillage. I use the tractor to spread this. I don't mind driving the tractor over pasture because there's all those perennial roots holding the soil in place. But as soon as we till and form beds, we no longer drive the tractor in the fields. I want to avoid that compaction and just the ease of just like doing things you don't want to do. As soon as you start driving the tractor into the field, you miss the bed by a little bit, all of a sudden you've like put a tire mark right through the middle of your bed. So yeah, one-time tillage, spread your compost, your soil amendments, whatever. It's helpful to do a soil test first, just to see if you're super acidic or super low in certain nutrients, then you can add more minerals. So I'm not against soil chemistry. I think broad strokes, it has its place to amend. But really what the focus is getting that soil biology going. So I'm going to talk about 3 methods that we've used. So the first method is my favorite, where you smother, or you till, smother, and then cover crop so that the following year it's ready to go, jump started. That requires you to have time, right? Because you're not getting a crop out of it this year. So that might not be realistic if you're starting out. So that method 2 is using plastic mulch. That way, if you need immediate revenue, you can till and smother it with the plastic mulch while you're growing a crop out of that, through that mulch. It's called mulch, but I don't think plastic mulch is actually not mulch in my opinion. But that plastic membrane will smother your perennial weeds. We have a lot of quackgrass, or we had a lot of quackgrass on the farm, so there was really no other option. You either till like 10 times to kill it, or you smother it. Those are kind of the ways, or you, I guess you spray it with herbicides. But so yeah, I found plastic mulch. I'm not a huge fan of it in general, but this, again, this one-time transition to get your beds established and to get a cash crop while they're establishing is how I formed most of my beds. And then there's the purest method of sheet mulching, which has 0 tillage, but requires not just time, but extra energy and money for all those materials. So I think sheet mulching is great at very small scale. Once you try to scale that up commercially, I think it doesn't really pay off. But if you have the time, energy, and money, like that's a great way to go. So yeah, I'm going to walk through each of these 3, what they look like. This is method 1, which remember is we're going to do our one-time tillage, then smother it, and then cover crop it. So this is the pasture. Also happens to be where we had our annual bonfire. That's optional. So I don't know if you can really see it here, but this is all just like pasture. It's perennial grasses, some weeds in there, the whole mix. So we spread compost and then are tilling it in with the BCS vertiplow. I'm sure you all familiar with that. I don't need to describe.
We also have one at the farm.
Oh, nice.
Later on,
Sweet.
so if you want to look at that implement, we own it.
Sweet. So yeah, you can see that it's basically like a corkscrew that kind of inverts the soil and chops it up at the same time, kind of mimicking a plow and disc all in one pass. Definitely tillage, definitely not easy on the soil, but it spits it out to the side, so once you have it all tilled up, you can make a pass up and down each path and you have your raised bed. So it's a really easy way to form raised beds. And then, oh yeah, so what I didn't show is we spread compost and amendments before that initial till. So then we tarp it. So the beds are formed, but all that grass, all that sod is in there, and it would just resprout and turn back to pasture pretty quickly if we didn't tarp it. So I think we tilled it beginning of July. So then it had all of July and some of August to just cook out those perennial grasses. I think it got hot enough too. We had a hotter summer than normal. I think it killed some of that top weed seed layer too, which is rare for us in Maine. So then we pull off the tarp and cover the soil. When you pull off that tarp, that's like the most fragile exposed soil there is, right? It's been freshly tilled, it's been killed of all like vegetation. Like get that covered right away, because that if you have a storm or whatever, that's going to do a lot of damage. You're going to, you might not even see it, but you're going to have micro erosion with those soil particles dropping down and clogging your pore space. So yeah, get that compost on right away. Even that layer of compost will stop that erosion from happening because compost doesn't have those fine soil particles like soil does. So yeah, get that spread. We mulch the paths with wood chips. Top of the bed, we actually use, this is a bark mulch compost. It's purely from bark mulch. I'll talk more about that later. But compost. And then direct seed it to cover crop. This is a fall mix that will winter kill, and we seeded it in August. I'll talk more about that mix when I talk about cover crops. But yeah, we seed it pretty densely with cover crops. You can see one of our hedgerows like flopping over into the plot a little bit there. This is it coming up. I think it was 5 or 6 species mix. So this is nature doing the work for us, right? This is injecting carbon and biology down into the soil so that that life below there can be jump-started and ready for next year. We also inoculated the seeds of the cover crop with mycorrhizal fungus spores and the legumes with the rhizobia bacteria. So that's a very small amount of inoculant. Put it on the seed, you spread that over that whole plot, and that life can get going under there. I'll talk more about mycorrhizal fungus later. Partly, I really wanted to get the life back in the soil because we had that giant bonfire, and I feel like that just probably killed like all the life in like a 30 diameter stretch. First I also back dragged all the ash from that and I spread it over the whole plot too, so it wasn't concentrated. So then this is just a couple weeks ago. This is what that plot looks like right now. And this is ready for us to rotate our turkeys over, and they will add more biology. They'll graze it down and add fertility for next year. Next spring, all of these will winter kill. Next year we'll have, it'll be like a brown chaff, almost look like straw on top of the bed, and we can plant right through that. So that's my preferred method. If you have the time, this is a great way to open up new ground for vegetables. It does involve that single tillage and that disturbance of targeting, but I feel like it ends with this, which is more than making up for it. If you don't have the time, here's method 2. Again, you start with the BCS bird plow, mix in whatever amendments you want to. Form your raised beds, but then we lay plastic mulch. Again, once, this is not an ongoing practice, to smother those perennial weeds. For brassicas in the summer, we used white plastic to keep the soil a little cooler, but usually we use black plastic because we're in Maine, so the soil stays pretty cool anyway. And yeah, this is great because like I said, you can be smothering those perennial grasses while you're getting a cash crop. So it's kind of a trade-off between the ecological and the economic.
Still wood chips in the aisles?
No, this is leaves in the paths. Yeah, we use mostly leaves in the paths, although I've started transitioning more to wood chips because our leaves come with a little bit of trash in them, which is continually annoying me. But yeah, we get a lot of leaves. I'll talk about that. And we also get a lot of wood chips. Those are our most local resources since we live in a suburban area. So yeah, here's the method again. Notice the paths are thickly mulched with leaves. So even though we're using plastic, we still have complete soil coverage. So we're checking that box. And then here it is again, method 2. So it is on a very small scale. Spread compost and amendments first. Till it up with the bird plow. You form these sort of chunky raised beds. You can rake them out a little bit. It kind of stuffs the grass back in so it lays kind of flat. And so that's your one-time tillage to incorporate and form raised beds. And then we just lay the plastic, this time black plastic, by hand. It can be tempting to pull out those sod chunks from under the plastic, but don't do that. I learned the hard way. If those are in the path, they'll just resprout in the path. So get all those chunks under the plastic, even though that makes it a little harder to plant into. Try to get all that sod up under there so that it can be smothered. And then these beds, the plastic comes off and that's what they look like. So you have you still have your leaf mulch in the paths, and you have your kind of prepped, weed-free, blank canvas for whatever you're doing next. Again, this is soil in its most fragile state, so get it covered. Whatever kind of mulch you're using, or whatever kind of, if you don't have access to compost or mulch, at least seed it right away to cover crop or something, so it doesn't get damaged by the elements. Again, it's those internal organs of the earth. They're just out there dangling. So yeah, get it covered. My rule of thumb is 2 to 3 cubic yards per 1,000 square feet. So that's about a cubic yard and a half per bed. One of our beds, being 5 feet on center and 100 feet long, is 500 square feet. So that's what this picture is 1.5 cubic yards per bed. And that's enough, I find, that you don't need to be super meticulous about raking, and you'll still get complete coverage. If you go much less, you can still get complete coverage, but you have to be really careful raking that you're not stirring up the soil from underneath. So again, we're shooting for complete soil coverage, compost on the beds, leaves in the paths. It's kind of the seamless blanket over the soil. This is our pick your own garden for CSA members. And you can see we're expanding it. Those 3 beds are new this year. That's why I have black plastic on the left. So method 3, sheet mulching. If you have the time, energy, and money for it, the bed in the foreground, this bed, is sheet mulch directly on top of the pasture. Basically, we expanded the plot by 1 bed, put a layer of leaves down about 6 inches thick, and then a layer of compost on top of that, 6 inches thick, and planted the onions right into that immediately. And that's a lot of material, so it took a lot of time to spread and a lot of money to buy, but those are some of the most fertile beds on the farm now. So it's that trade-off. The onions did pretty well. Sheet mulching, they are more prone to drying out because they're just growing in like pure organic matter instead of the roots getting down into soil, which holds water better. So do be aware of that. If you do sheet mulch, you're going to have to irrigate more, especially as they're getting established before the roots get down through all that material.
Were you adding any other amendments besides the leaf and compost?
For those that didn't, because we were adding so much compost and leaves, I figured they had all the food they needed. For other beds, we might add a little bit of fertilizer sometimes at planting, or rock powders, depending on the soil test. But less and less over the years, and I'll talk about that. So here's another example of,
I know, so with the sheet mulch, you added the compost and the leaves, you put it on top. Is there ever a time at which that mulch, the sheets get connected with the soil? I mean, tilled up or turned up or mixed up, whatever the right
Do we ever till it in to mix it up? Yeah. No, so we leave that to the worms. Yeah, the sheet mulch goes right on top, and now I think this was beginning of last year, so we're a year and a half later, and those beds are awesome. Yeah, they no longer feel like they're up above the ground because the worms have been going up and down, and it's kind of a natural mixing that happens. That first year, it definitely feels like you have to irrigate more. While those leaves are breaking down, those crops aren't going to do quite as well. So even if you do go through the time, energy, and money, like that first crop is not going to be as good as subsequent crops in my experience.
Would you say it's, transplanting is better first into those beds versus direct seeding?
We also direct seeded some of the carrots. So either way is fine as long as you keep it irrigated appropriately. Yeah, especially like germinating carrots, you really gotta keep it wet. In case you didn't pick up on it, like I feel like method 1 is my preferred. Method 2 feels more practical, and this feels like a nice way to like add little gardens here and there, or 1 bed at a time. But to do this at scale would just be a huge amount of material.
So when you lay that material out, did you lay it out by hand so you could have the raised beds, or did you?
Yep, so we do all our spreading with wheelbarrows,
Okay.
and I'll get to that. Yeah, it's kind of a hybrid. We have the tractor do the heavy lifting, but then the humans do the pinpoint spreading. So this is another example of sheet mulching. This is our like perennial pick your own area that all the customers have to walk through to get to the barn. So I wanted to create this little like Eden experience as they walk into the barn. So yeah, that was just, we did this with the tractor actually. Dump trailers of leaves, drag it around with the tractor, then dump trailers of compost on top, and then wood chips the paths. And the first year I kind of struggled because it's so much material. I don't think I irrigated enough, but now this year it's like going gangbusters. So I think that's kind of a lesson of sheet mulching for me, is it takes kind of a year to mellow. So almost in a perfect world, you'd sheet mulch and then cover crop that first year, and then the next year you'd be like really golden. But then you're spending a lot of time, energy, and money, and with no yield that first year. So all these trade-offs of what we got to do to make a living. So then once the beds are established, here's how we flip them. And everything gets a whole lot easier once they're established. That first initial work is a lot of work, you know, especially with a BCS walking tractor. Like it goes slow, and you can maybe do like 20 beds in a day, like, and you're tired. So yeah, once they're established, it's the road's been paved for ease. Because then to flip them, it can be as simple as just pull any weeds that are in there, spread a layer of compost, and plant into it. Or if they're overgrown, like if they just totally got away from you and there's tons of weeds, or if like you have broccoli plants that need to come out or whatever, then we mow it and tarp it to make sure that those plants don't regrow from the roots. Pull off the tarp, and again, either plant right into it or spread another layer of compost and plant into that. In the early years, I spread compost before every single crop, without fail, because the soil, I was just building the soil. Having done that for 9 years, I'm to the point where like it doesn't need more compost. We're at 12% organic matter. Our nutrients are like all kind of off the charts. So at this point, we just literally like rake it out and direct seed into it. So this is carrots. I don't know how well you can see this, but these two beds were lettuce heads. They got harvested. We just gave it a light rake to, you know, fill any dips and holes, and then push the earthway seeder right through that to seed the carrots. That was it.
Does the lettuce come back through?
We make sure to harvest it low enough that it doesn't, but yeah, if it starts to regrow, then we just cut right below the crown, the lettuce heads. We try to always avoid pulling roots out. Those roots are delicious food for all the good guys down there.
What are you mowing with?
Flail mower on the BCS is what we use to mow. So flail mower is basically like these blades on a central axis that just flail around, and they chop everything up very finely, everything above ground, and you can set it to go right down to the soil surface or just above. So it's kind of like a chipper shredder on wheels that you can just walk down the bed. So you're not removing any of that material, you're just chopping it up and laying it on top of the bed, to the point that, and it's chopped up enough to the point that you can usually even push earthway seeder through that chaff. If it's too thick for that, we just rake off a little bit into the paths and then push the earthway seeder through it. So again, leaving crop residues in place is great. You know, that's nature's model. And then, but to ensure that the kale doesn't just regrow from the roots and keep, you know, sucking up nutrients and competing with the next crop, we can tarp it first for anywhere from 5 days or even less in the summer to maybe 10 days in the shoulder seasons. Tarping effectiveness is really related to the temperature, I find. So the hotter it is, the less you have to tarp. And I've really been playing with that, minimizing that tarp time, because this is not nature's model, right? There's no photosynthesis. This is like going backwards, right? We're killing life actively by tarping. So I think tarping, gotta be careful here. Tarping's been kind of like espoused as this new no-till, like revelational practice. And I think it can help with that, but I don't think by tarping itself is not the thing that's making the soil healthier. It's enabling us to avoid tillage, which is great. But let's remember those 4 principles of soil health. The first one is maximize photosynthesis. This is not that. So I'm trying to use tarps as little as possible, just enough to kill that root system so that the next crop can get established. Is there a question back there?
Do you do anything to alleviate the compaction from the tires after mowing?
Do we do anything to alleviate the compaction from the BCS tires? I don't. I guess if it feels compacted when we're transplanting, we will broad fork. For the most part, our beds are fluffy enough that I'm not too worried about it. Also, if we're mowing, that means there are established roots in the ground. So that helps prevent compaction. We never mow an empty bed. So yeah.
Yeah, just have you ever tried composting over the flail?
Composting after flail mowing?
Yeah, after.
Absolutely. Yep. So that's what I would do in the early years. I did that every time. Every time we flipped a bed, I'd spread another 1.5 inches of compost after flailing.
I like that short tarp time, 5 to 10 days. Is that working for cover crops as well as following cash crops?
Yeah, great question. Does that 5 to 10 days work for cover crops as well as cash crops? It depends on what stage they're in. But yeah, I think I'll get into it. But when rye is starting to flower, if you time it right, it really doesn't take much to kill it. So 5 to 10 days, maybe 5 would be pushing it, but 10 days in early June has worked for us.
How wide are your tarps?
Our tarps are 20 feet by 100 feet. These are actually old tarps that we no longer use. These are from a few years ago that were shorter. They were half bed in length.
So the tarp covers 4 or 5 beds, 20 feet.
So yeah, I think they're actually a little over 20 feet. So they cover 4 beds with enough to overlap on the next tarp. That's pretty key, that overlap. Otherwise, if you have 2 tarps right up against each other, then you get this seam of weeds. You need to overlap by at least 6 inches to really keep that from happening.
So is that your irrigation spacing also?
It's not, which is annoying. So our irrigation spacing is every 3 beds. Or a line of sprinklers covers 6 beds. So that's kind of annoying. We have to remove those 4 sprinklers to do the tarp. If they sold tarps that were 3 beds, I think that would be perfect, but I haven't found that.
How often are you adding material to your pathways?
How often do we add material to the pathways? Yeah, so we, any beds that don't get cover crop for the winter get mulched with leaves, and then in the spring we rake those leaves into the path. So that's every year pretty much.
Are you using aged leaves or new leaves?
I've used both. Yeah, depending on how much I stockpiled in the past.
I feel like new leaves for us, they just blow away.
New leaves tend to blow away, yeah. Not all of them blow away though. I find just a few blow away, and as soon as we get a rain, they kind of suction in, and then you get the fungal action happening. So yeah, unless we get really unlucky with like a big dry windstorm right after we spread, I find it works out for us. Yeah, and we get pretty good winds. We're not like on an exposed mountaintop or anything, but we get some decent winds. So again, the tarp comes off, and just to beat the horse dead, remember this soil is in its fragile state, so get it planted right away, get it covered. And this is what I was talking about, so for beds that it's too late for us to get a cover crop established. I don't know if that's a concept you all can relate to, but in Maine, if we don't seed like a fall cover crop by September 1st, it's too late. It's not really going to establish well. An overwintered cover crop like rye needs to get in by October 1st. So that doesn't work if we're growing fall carrots that are harvested late October, right? So those carrots come out, that soil is totally exposed and fragile, and there's no time to plant cover crops, so that's when we will come and spread leaves, mulch them for the winter with leaves. Then in the spring, we just rake those leaves off the bed into the path and plant right into that. And in the early years, that's when I would spread a whole nother layer of compost as well. Or you could even do that in the fall before you mulch with leaves, spread your compost and then leaves on top. That way all you have to do in the spring is rake it off. Question in the back, yeah?
Does how you manage or flip beds differ from in the field versus undercover in the hoop house?
In the hoop houses?
In your 8-9 years of growing, have you seen any side effects of too much compost or having to be careful with how much you put in?
Yeah, so 2 questions. First, the hoop house. We aren't as careful about mulching in the hoop house, typically because we'll grow winter greens or something in there over the winter. Also, it doesn't have rain and snow falling on it, so I'm not as worried about erosion. So yeah, a little bit different in the high tunnel, but other than not mulching it in the winter, I'd say we treat it just the same way, same bed spacing, same practices. The other question was, do we ever see too much effects of too much compost or too many leaves? Yes, I'll talk about the compost. We've definitely overloaded certain nutrients in the past. I'll talk about that. That's why we've switched to a different kind of compost. And it's definitely spreading the mulch for winter is a fine-tuned rate so that it's thick enough for good coverage, but not so thick that you have nowhere to put it come spring. Because our paths are only 18 inches wide. Like they can look like this in the spring, you know, you're trying to cram all these leaves there, and then your beds end up being narrower than they would be otherwise. So it can actually like backfire, and you have a lot less planting space if you spread them too thick. That's really the only negative effect. That's sort of a logistical effect in terms of soil health. I haven't seen anything negative about going big with mulches or compost. So here's an alternative to raking off in the spring. You can just prep them in the fall and leave the compost exposed. And that way all you have to do in the spring is walk out in the mud and stick a seedling in the ground. There's no bed prep required. I think this isn't probably quite as good as soil coverage. Just compost, probably not as good as compost and then leaves on top, but it also, these beds will warm faster in the spring, and that's something to consider with mulching for the winter is, especially in our climate, that's going to delay soil warming in the spring, which can be a big setback if you have a short growing season like us. Yeah?
Have you always mulched your pathways, like since
Yep.
9 years back?
Yep, always. Yeah, and that's, there are huge benefits to that. I definitely recommend thinking about that if you have access to any kind of mulch. I find that the plants on the shoulders of our beds grow way healthier than the plants in the middle because they're tapping into all that mulch goodness. So yeah, the biology in our paths is greater than the biology in our beds because of that mulch. Which is funny to see because we're only applying amendments, rock powders, all these magical good things only on the beds, but then the paths are healthier. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you had to reform your beds every couple of years, and if so, have the wood chips gotten in the way?
Great question. Yeah. So
trash in your bed.
Right. Right. Do we ever reform our beds? And if so, does wood chips in the paths get mixed in? So yes, we do reform the beds. Because after about 3 or 4 years, I find they just kind of flatten out, whether we've raked a little too hard into the paths or the paths have just built up. Then it's hard to tell where the bed is again. So that's when we'll come through just a pass up and down each path. So the bed itself isn't getting tilled, but that compost in the paths is getting spit back up onto the beds. And that is when I spread wood chips now. So that means it won't be done again for 3 or 4 years, and by then the wood chips will have broken down. Yeah. I don't spread wood chips other than that time after freshly formed beds. Yeah. And again, like, you don't need to reform your beds if you want other ways of marking where they are. I know Connor Crickmore at Never Sink has little posts and runs strings because he doesn't like raised beds. So yeah, there are other methods there. So yeah, mulch. Let's talk mulch. This is nature's form of weed control. If you ever see a place, soil without photosynthesis in nature, it's because it's covered in a thick layer of mulch. So like the forest floor would be the obvious example. Although that does have photosynthesis, it's just up high. So yeah, this is what happens naturally when plant material, falls over and it creates a mulch. So we're kind of mimicking that in an artificial way by importing it. I'll talk about also ways to grow it in place, which is maybe a little bit more natural. This is when we mulched the garlic with a straw, and then had straw for the next season, so we couldn't direct seed. But the garlic did great. So yeah, this really shifts the focus of weed control to prevention rather than constant killing. I think just psychologically, emotionally, this feels way better than having to go out with a hoe and constantly just kill plant growth that's trying to cover the soil. So mostly we use leaves. Straw is harder to access for us. Leaves I get by the tractor trailer load from our local municipality, because people like to rake their yards, and then those leaves come to us. I wait till late enough in the season that all the grass clippings are not in the leaves anymore. So I don't collect, I tell them I don't want the first few weeks of leaves that get dropped off. And then after that, I find it's pretty pure leaves. We still get little bits of trash, which is annoying. But the leaves have been a big part of our no-till management.
Why do you avoid the grass clippings?
By waiting later.
No, why?
Oh, why? Grass, people do crazy stuff with their lawns around us, and yeah, they spray all sorts of stuff on there. So yeah, I think people do less crazy things with the trees. So the leaves tend to be pretty clean. And this was a healthy discussion I had with my certifier too, of how am I ensuring that these leaves aren't contaminated. So yeah, that was one sort of compromise, and then we try to pick out the trash by hand, which is annoying, but we're in a suburban environment, so they're not very trashy. If you go to urban leaves, I've gotten one load of leaves from the city of Portland and never again. It was just too much garbage. We mostly get dog toys.
So you just mentioned your certifier. Going back to the second option, do they give you a hard time at all about using plastic sheeting?
No, so Organic Standard allows for plastic mulches. There's no problem with that as long as you remove it at the end of the year, and as long as it's not biodegradable. Currently there are no biodegradable plastics approved for organic use, so you do have to remove them. So yeah, this is how our leaves arrive. It's a 90-yard tractor trailer load. We get about 10 of them a year. So we don't use all 10 every year, but that means some can sit and kind of decompose and be great leaf mold for the next year or two. So yeah, tapping into these waste streams. If you live anywhere near population centers, chances are there's some kind of waste stream you can tap into. And finding that and hooking up with it can be a really good thing. Or you can grow your own mulch. This is rye, overwintered rye. And this came in a little thin, so the pads could probably use some extra mulch. And that's a good thing to be ready to do. if you grow your own mulch, have a little bit of extra straw or leaves or something to fill in if it's too thin. Because there's the no man's land of mulching is like a thin mulch that weeds grow through, and then you can't hoe them. So then you're left like trying to pull weeds through mulch, which if there are only a few, it's fine. But if you have a significant weed pressure, that can really bite you in the butt. So yeah, if you're gonna mulch, make sure it's seamless, and you can't see the soil through that mulch. So yeah, how do we spread all this material? It's a huge amount of material, and we're a human scale farm. It's a lot of work, but I see it as front loading the work of the season, because then we do so much less work weeding. I think as farmers we're often used to like just getting plants in the ground real quick, and then we'll spend all season weeding them. Well, we do extra work the fall before, and maybe even the spring, in prepping the beds, but then we're basically like, it's very easy to weed, and we keep things entirely weed free. So it's worth it. This is it's just this seamless coverage, and it's like you just press the transplants into brownie batter, right? It's like, and then there's no weeds, so it's pretty great. So yeah, never see the soil. Who grows this crop? Just one?
Comfrey?
This is turmeric, yeah, which is a tropical understory crop. We grow half decent in Maine in the greenhouse. But yeah, the point of this picture is it's complete soil coverage. You never see the soil. That's kind of my mantra. I'm always telling the crew, just never see the soil. So yeah, in terms of spreading rates, that initial compost application before you till to open a new plot, I've gone really big on that, up to 20 wheelbarrows per 100-foot bed. If your soil organic matter is really low, that can be a great way to jumpstart the soil life. Or as much as you can afford. It doesn't need to be that big.
Is that a 6 cubic?
Yeah, 6 cubic foot, yeah. So then cubic yards per acre, 200 to 400 cubic yards per acre. So that picture I showed you early on of the like compost on top of pasture and you couldn't see the pasture, that's like 400 cubic yards per acre. That's what that rate looks like. If we're just spreading a layer of compost as mulch on top of the beds, we do 7 wheelbarrows per bed, which is about a cubic yard and a half, or 135 per acre. And then for, the winter leaf mulch, we do about 9 wheelbarrows per bed. And that's pretty key. You don't want to do more than that because otherwise you'll lose bed space the next year because there'll be nowhere to rake it. And if you do much less than that, you'll get spring weeds growing up through it. So that's kind of the happy medium I've found. And here's the too much leaf mulch, difficult to rake off, too little weeds which can't be hoed. This is how we do the spreading. We have a little 35 horsepower tractor, which the bucket is perfect width for 3 wheelbarrows. So we line the 3 wheelbarrows up at the head of a plot, dump it in there, and then push the wheelbarrows down and apply just where it's needed. So I think this is a really great kind of balance between having the machine do the heavy lifting that can become drudgery, but having humans do the careful application and walking on the paths, which a machine can kind of make a mess of. And we do this quickly. So 4 of us, 1 on the tractor, 3 with wheelbarrows, we can do an entire plot of 1,200-foot beds in an hour. So, and this is, people love this too. The crew love it. They're like, we get a little tempo going, and the tractor's coming, and they got to get the wheelbarrows back in time. And so it's a lot of fun. We spend a lot of the fall doing this because we do a lot of our bed prep in the fall. And again, it's this kind of social fun thing instead of drudgery of filling a million wheelbarrows by hand. And then we just rake it out by hand, and that's it. So here's the question. Yeah, can you have too much of a good thing with compost? Yes, you can. This is our a soil test from a number of years ago, or a few years ago. You can see our organic matter is up, 11.4%. Everything is like off the charts, but what's really off the charts is phosphorus. And that's what happens if you apply animal-based compost over and over and over at high rates. And this turns into an ethical question because there's not a lot of downside production-wise to having a huge amount of phosphorus in your soil, but it does potentially lead to pollution of local waterways, eutrophication. So yeah, I guess I feel a moral obligation to address this and not just keep applying animal-based compost over and over. So that's where I searched out this other source of compost made from bark mulch. So it's just tree bark that's sat and composted and is very low in nutrients, but still acts as that mulch layer for weed suppression and organic matter. Yes?
I guess it kind of goes back to the same question I asked, but this is having to do with your water that you irrigate with. Are you careful, do you have it tested, are you careful what you irrigate with in a hoop house as far as salts being in the water and evaporation leaving the salts behind?
Oh yeah, so do I...
That's right. I don't know if you irrigate from a pond or from a well.
No, I irrigate from a drilled well, so maybe that's... I've never thought about that, like how much salts are building up based on irrigation water. In my mind, if anything, by irrigating, I'm leaching out some of the salts from the high tunnels, but I'm not sure. Yeah, that'd be a good question. For the first time, I just took the specific test for high tunnel salt accumulation. I just sent that off, so we'll see.
How often do you test your soil?
I test my soil once a year in the fall.
That bark mulch, is that, where are you seeking that out? Is that from a tree service, or is that?
So the bark mulch was hard to find. It's through the lumber industry in Maine. It's because they debark the lumber as they saw it up. So again, searching out your particular little niche and contacts is work to do. But yeah, I was pulling my hair out when I saw this because I was like, oh no, we rely on this compost as mulch, and now I got to stop applying it. What am I going to do? So that's what I found. Also, we're trying to do more cover crops, which will, not require as much compost. So yeah, I do soil tests once a year, and I only do them once a year because I see them as they're really, really specific of this really broad ecosystem of the soil, right? They're very specific data, the decimal place, which makes it really tempting to treat them as this really, scientific result. But I think soil tests should be taken with a big grain of salt. Soil scientists once said to me, looking at soil in terms of the different chemical nutrients is describing the way you love your child in terms of the chemistry of your bodies. It's okay, it's not wrong, but it's maybe not where the emphasis should be. So I think it's really the life in the soil that matters, and certainly the chemistry has some interplay with that, but be careful about thinking too hard about the chemistry. That's the way I see it. So yeah, too much manure-based compost leads to excessive phosphorus. So searching out a vegan compost is a good idea. Yeah, it can. I guess when you have excessive P, it can tie up other minerals. I haven't seen that too much, but it definitely increases the risk of pollution. So yeah, here's the manure-based and the vegan. Manure-based tends to be tends to have 2 to 3% nitrogen, 1 to 3% phosphorus, 1 to 2% potassium. It varies widely, but that's kind of the typical range. Whereas vegan compost is much lower nutrients. Yeah.
If you had to do it over again, starting from scratch on a low nutrient soil, would you start with the manure-based compost?
Absolutely. I would still start with the manure-based compost, but watch those soil tests. Once the phosphorus gets to recommended levels, switch to the vegan compost.
And I think Ben Hartman talks about this too. He calls it like black compost and brown compost. So yeah, finding that source of vegan compost, even if you make it yourself, just like stockpile any kind of plant material, like whether it's spent brewer grains or wood chips or whatever. If you can stockpile them long enough, that will turn just like a static pile of compost, and you can use that as your mulch. But you have to think way ahead, so it's compost and not, chunky debris.
You're able to get away without using other amendments because you're using the manure-based.
Yeah, although I did spread other amendments initially when we first did that first tillage, based on a soil test. Like some of our trace minerals were really low, so I added, dried seaweed and rock powders and stuff.
So cover cropping. This is like the core of organic farming, I feel like, which I didn't appreciate fully when I started. I just spread tons and tons of compost and thought that was good enough. But remember, that's kind of ignoring the liquid carbon pathway, which is the source of terrestrial life. So importing stuff from off the farm is great, but like let's grow it in place too. So I'm going to go over 3 mixes. We got our spring or fall mix. So this is in the fall. We'll plant this where next year's early spring crops are going. That way the fall mix will winter kill, and we'll be able to plant right through the stubble or rake the stubble into the paths if we're direct seeding. And then for beds that aren't going to get planted until later in the summer, we do an overwintered mix, usually with rye always with rye as the foundation. Is that out of order? So yeah, the spring or fall mix is usually the same or similar mix, and it grows quickly in cool weather. We need to seed it by September 1st in zone 4B to have it be worthwhile to grow. It's a good balance of carbon and nitrogen, and it winter kills and rakes off easily. The overwintered mix establishes well even when seeded late. For us, October 1st is kind of the cutoff. Huge amount of organic matter, living roots in the ground all winter, which is a big benefit relative to the winter kill mix. And then it's ready to knock down late May, early June for us. And it potentially creates a thick in situ mulch, so grown in place mulch for the next season. The rye also has an allelopathic effect that reduces seed germination of weeds. So in addition to being a mulch, it's also a weed suppressant chemically. And then this year I experimented with a summer mix. So that's actually like sacrificing the growing season to just feed the soil and revitalize those beds during warm weather. So I'm going to go through each of these 3, and Jessica told me we only have an hour left, so I'm gonna blast and try to hold your questions till the end. There'll be time after lunch and around lunch for questions, because chances are I'll answer your question later in the slideshow anyway. But write them down. We'll talk about them later. I'm going to go quick. So here we are, peas and oats. This is kind of the basic spring or fall mix. This is spring planted peas and oats. But this is, they're waist high, they're flowering. We used to mow them with a flail mower at that point. But that is actually even more of a disturbance than I think is necessary. So now we just knock them down. And here's us rolling them, human scale. So yeah, they came up with that on their own. That's another reason why having a lot of humans on a piece of land is great, because there's innovation that happens. For those who couldn't see that, some of the crew just put on their rain gear and rolled over the peas and oats to knock them down. We also have we have other systems of knocking them down, which I'll get to as well. I think the main challenge with that is dizziness. So then we'll tarp the beds for 1 to 2 weeks I really think with peas and oats, probably 1 week, if it's warm weather, is enough. Again, trying to minimize that tarp period, because that's active soil degradation happening. But it's a sacrifice we're making in order to terminate that cover crop. So then when that tarp pulls off, that's what it looks like. It's basically like this sort of straw chaff that we just rake into the pads. So that's what the pads look like. The pads are nicely mulched. The beds are ready for direct seeding. So in this case, we direct seeded storage radishes, daikons, watermelon, black Spanish radish, and we didn't add anything, just seed. And that's the crop. It ended up being over 500 pounds per bed of storage radish. And that whole process, the only input was seed and human time, right? There's no machines, no fertilizer, no row cover. So this really feels like kind of like a model maybe to try to fit as many crops into this method as we can. So even better though is the overwintered mix, because that maintains that living roots in the ground and even photosynthesizing through the winter. The rye actually stays green right through the winter, even when we hit -20s. So this is kind of even a higher level than the peas and oats. So this is rye and crimson clover. Both, that's a nice mix because they flower about the same time, end of May, early June for us. Normally crimson clover doesn't overwinter for us, but I find when it's planted with rye, the rye insulates it. So it actually did overwinter. It's normally a zone 6 cover crop, and we're zone 4. So maybe we just got lucky, but I think if planted on its own, it would have winter killed. So here we are. This is after the onions are harvested. We direct seed rye and clover. If anyone's been following our Instagram, I'm sorry, these are probably all repeat photos. So we just push the earthway seeder, one with the beat plate for rye seed, one with the carrot plate for clover, and get 2 people every other row. One plot is 3 miles of walking, which, you know, is a nice little walk, but it doesn't take too long, and then you get a really good germination, and then it looks like that the next spring, which we then knocked down. This was not this year, but last year, we just used a board to knock it down. The goal of knocking it down is really just to be able to get a tarp over it, because you try to drag a tarp over it, you just create a tent if it's not knocked down, and that'll blow away. So knocking it down with a board worked pretty well, but this year we had an equipment upgrade, and we got a T-post. So I don't know if you can really see that, but it's just a 4-foot or 5-foot T-post that we took twine to tie our foot on and to hold it. And then 2 people just walk in unison, stomping it down. And the T-post is nice because it has that, you know, the T part of it is kind of like a blunt blade. So you actually do get a little more crimping. You get some crimping action in there. I don't think it would be enough to fully crimp without tarping afterward. I feel like the tarp afterwards is necessary to fully terminate the rye. But I think there's room for experimenting with that. You could even like sharpen it a little bit or stomp really hard and maybe try crimping without tarping. Room for innovation there. Speaking of innovation that kind of works, not really. This is a snowshoe with a piece of angle iron strapped to it. That was a fun experiment. We learned that if you do that, you can only do 1 at a time, because if you do 2, you're like bow-legged, like hitting your ankles. So, but I think that the 2-person with a T-post is the preferred method. Kind of obvious, but maybe not. Make sure they all orient in the same direction. So when you get to the end, you got to walk back, because otherwise, when you drag the tarp,
it'll snag against the grain on some beds and not others. So yeah, you got to drag the tarp with the grain. So that's what it looks like. Yeah, tarping it with a silage tarp. We use, I think they're 22 feet, or a little over 20 feet by 100 foot silage tarp, 5 mil. Johnny's sells them. And then we use concrete blocks, 8 by 8 by 8 concrete blocks to weigh them down. I prefer those to sandbags. Sandbags degrade in the sun, require filling, and can even grow weeds depending on what they're filled with. Concrete blocks are stackable. You can carry them easily. They don't degrade. And they enable this this sort of modular system. We call them the smother kit pallet, where it's a layer of concrete blocks on a pallet with the one tarp on top, and that's enough blocks to weigh down that tarp. And the concrete blocks raise the tarp up so that it doesn't get damaged by the forks as it lifts the pallet. So we can move these around wherever they're needed, and it means that whenever anybody's taking the tarp off, that pallet is right there ready to go and load it up. There's never a question of like, what do we do with this giant thing of plastic in the meantime? Going back here, I just wanted to point out, this is the rye that's tarped. This is the peas and oats, spring seeded. You can see it's only 12 inches tall, and we've already tarped 6 foot tall rye. That's the difference between overwintered versus spring planted cover crop. You can see how much more photosynthesis happened with that rye relative to the peas and oats. So I think that's really something to shoot for, building into the crop plan where we can, overwintered cover crop, not just short spouts of peas and oats or buckwheat or whatever that are easier to manage, but don't photosynthesize as much. Oh yeah, it's 30. I find it takes 30 concrete blocks to lay down a 24, I guess they're 24 by 100 foot tarp. It's definitely worth, if you're windier area, use more blocks. It's easier to put more blocks down than it is to go chasing a tarp around the farm. So this is when we uncover the rye. It's a pretty solid mat of straw, and it's still attached to its roots. It hasn't been severed, hasn't been mowed, and we just plant right through that using a measuring tape, since a rolling dibble or anything wouldn't show up. So we just use a measuring tape. It requires a little longer transplanting time because you're having to separate the straw. But again, we're front loading that work so that later on there's really no weeding. So we've also, in soil that's a little compacted, because even though it's growing rye, that root mass can actually be really intact still. So planting into that with your bare hands can be hard. So sometimes we actually take a broad fork, turn it parallel to the bed, and use it as a dibble. So kind of wiggle it a little bit, and the tines are every 4 inches. So depending on your spacing, you can go every second or third, fourth tine hole. And then there's not much work at all. You just kind of push the transplant in.
You didn't mention how long you tarp the overwinter stuff to kill it.
I think I've gone, the first time I did 2.5 weeks because I was scared of it. And then this year we just did barely 10 days and it was fine. So I think I might even try a week next year. When that rye all its energy is going up into the flower, it kind of wants to die. It's ready to, pass on to posterity. So yeah, it doesn't take much to kill, I find. I think if we tried to tarp it earlier, when it's green and only knee high, that would take a long time to tarp. So it's actually better to just wait and let it kind of send its energy up before knocking it down. So this is what it looks like transplanted. This was storage cabbages. So the soil is, fully covered, undisturbed, without any additions of organic matter, besides the grown in place mulch. And that's what the cabbage looks like later in the fall. And again, we had really good yields. I didn't actually weigh these, but every head was, 3-4 pounds. So yeah, again, it's there's no machines, there's no inputs, and there was really no weeds. We we weeded this by hand once for like 10 minutes, just pulling the few weeds that were coming up through that rye. Yeah, real quick.
Post-harvest, are you then just able to rake the rye residue of the pathway, or?
Yeah, so post-harvest, these were fall cabbages that came out late. We just added a little bit more leaf mulch on top for the winter because it was too late for a cover crop. And then the next spring, we raked all that rye and leaves into the paths and direct seeded. Yeah, that was this year. We did salad green successions in there. And those were awesome. Like, we didn't add anything. This soil is like amazing this year. Here it is again, this time planted with cucurbits, summer squash and cucumbers into overwintered rye. Here's the succession. I don't know if I can see that on the screen. But yeah, they did amazingly well. I think squash, cucurbits are like particularly well suited to planting through rye. Or if you do winter squash, I know that's a good one. Squash tends to not care too much about like being planted into stubble and competing with thick mulches. So here's the summer mix. I kind of went crazy and did 14 or 15 species cocktail. Just like throw it at the wall and see what sticks mentality. So I got a lot of the seed from greencoverseed.com. I really like that company because you can order by the pound. So you can make your custom mixes without buying like 10 or 50 pound sacks of seed. I also buy some from Fedco and Johnny's, our local seed companies. But they have a whole range of fun species at Green Cover Seed. So here it is coming up. I seeded it really thickly. That was one learning experience, especially for things like sorghum Sudan. It just takes up a lot of space. So a lighter seeding rate would probably be good, or even following the recommended seeded rates. That's an idea. So yeah, here's the mix, or that's part of the mix. I separated it by size since I wanted to direct seed it with the earthway. So everything for the beet plate was all those sorghum Sudan, cowpeas, sun hemp, mung beans, buckwheat, sunflower, safflower, and cilantro. And then the smaller radish plate, I did Burson clover, crimson clover, 2 types of millet, forage turnips, and some sweet alyssum. And basically it was a little excessive. Kind of got carried away because all of these things flower at different times, and I don't want like seed to be generated because then that's a potential weed problem. So if I were to do this again, I would simplify the mix. Maybe choose like 5 or 6 and try to line up the flowering times, and maybe not do as much buckwheat in there because buckwheat is really good at outcompeting things. So that established really quickly, but then that flowers and is done. So then the other things were kind of set back. Anyway, it was a good experimentation. This is what it was seeded. There it is. It established really quickly. You can see the buckwheat kind of, even though buckwheat was a very small percentage of the mix, it ended up being like maybe it looked like a third of the coverage was from buckwheat, which was fine. Buckwheat flowers are great for pollinators, but buckwheat doesn't sort of generate as much biomass as I was hoping for with the like Sudan and millet, sun hemp. There's the 1-year-old for perspective. So yeah, if we're thinking about those 4 principles of soil health: photosynthesis, diversity, soil coverage, and minimize disturbance. Like this is that, right? This is soil health, like actively being built. Even have the diversity of 15th species. But then the buckwheat was flowering, so I scythed it because I didn't want to mow it all the way down, and all I have is a flail mower, so I wanted to mow it at knee height. So we have a scythe, so we scythed it, which kind of knocked back the buckwheat, and then
There's the same 1-year-old. And then it regrew pretty well, but you start to see some yellowing, like, I don't know if you can actually see that, but basically it's so dense that it was kind of not generating as much biomass as it would have if it were seeded thinner. But it regrew, and then I ended up siding it 3 times over the course of the season because the millet started to go into seed. So I think it was great. I think like all that stuff that got sized sort of fell through. It grew up through that. I think that plot's going to be amazing, but there are those little tweaks I'd make. Yeah, you don't need so much diversity. And plan for the flowering times and to seed a little more care with the density of seeding. Those were the lessons I learned.
So if you plant that again, what are you going to do instead? What are you going to take out?
I'd probably take out the buckwheat and maybe a couple other species and focus on like sorghum Sudan grass, sun hemp, cowpeas. Kind of find a foundation mix, do most of those species that give them a lot more space, and then maybe fill in with a few other like little flowering species like cilantro and sweet lysum that aren't going to compete with those core biomass builders. But yeah, cover cropping really depends on your goals. So there's not one right thing to do. It depends what you're trying to, what your goals are. So you could be trying to break up compaction, in which case tap-rooted, deep tap roots like forage radish would be good. You might be trying to suppress weeds, like buckwheat's really good for that. You can suppress pests and disease with some of the brassicas will actually like fumigate or biofumigate the soil, like if you have a nematode problem. You can fix nitrogen with legumes. Build biomass with some of the more intense grasses like sorghum Sudan. Scavenge minerals, beneficial insects, forage, in situ mulch like the rye. But then there's all these considerations that I think got to pay attention to. The plant height, how tall it gets, especially if you're trying to undersow it to anything else. Compatibility with other crops in the mix, specifically around like winter kill temperatures. Like, are they going to die over the winter or not? What's going to come back in spring? When are they going to flower? When are you going to have to mow? Do those times line up for the different species? And then, how easy are they to kill? So all of those are kind of overlapping considerations. But yeah, I think experimentation is great because there's so many factors of your climate, your soil, how you're trying to fit it into your crop plan. So playing around with that is I found to be very exciting. I had a lot of fun with it. That was the plot I checked on the most this year, was the one that didn't earn any money. So here's some sample cocktails for us. We're again in zone 4B. So, modify it for your own. The winter sour is my cocktails. So we do oats, field peas, bell beans, or also known as fava beans, tillage radish, crimson clover, and cilantro. Those will all winter kill in our climate, except the crimson clover. If it's planted with an overwintered crop like rye, it might not winter kill, but in this mix it should. Then there's the summer soiler maker. This sorghum Sudan, millet, buckwheat, sun hemp, cowpeas, sweet lysum. That's basically the one I experimented with this year. I'd probably make those changes that I mentioned. And then the overwintery mix. Winter rye, definitely the foundation. But there's barley, vetch, Austrian winter peas. Vetch and winter peas are some of the only, and mammoth red clover. They're not very many legumes that will overwinter in Maine, or not many cover crops in general. So the barley probably won't overwinter, and the tillage radish definitely won't overwinter, but that's actually okay because
as it dies over the winter and decomposes in the spring, that's feeding the other species in the mix and will give them more space to grow to maturity. So not everything in the mix has to like have the same life cycle. Yeah, the more diversity there is, the more niches get filled. This is the oats on the left, just purely oats, and then peas and oats on the right. I ran out of pea seed, so that's why I ended up with just oats, and this was fascinating for me to see like how much, like I compensated with the seeding density. There's more, you know, there's as much seed put down in both scenarios, but the diversity means that the oats do better and the peas do better than if you're just doing oats by themselves. And you can really see that, like the soil coverage here and the photosynthesis is just clearly more than on the left. So that's going from 1 to 2 species. That's like, you know, double the diversity. I think once you start hitting 5, 6 species, there's maybe diminishing returns. So you don't need to go crazy like I did with 14. Because as you get more and more, it gets more complicated to manage them. So I feel like 4, 5, 6 is maybe the sweet spot for a mix. But certainly at least 2 or 3, I would say. I don't see any reason not to do more than 1. Again, here's our new plot we opened this year with the fall mix, which is oats, barley, fava beans, Austrian winter peas, which might overwinter, so we'll see. But I feel like if they do, they'll be easy to kill. Crimson clover and daikon radish. So then one great thing about cover crops is it makes it easy to integrate livestock into the vegetable operation. So you can stack your enterprises where they both benefit each other. You can increase the diversity, not just above ground, but all the microbes in the gut of the ruminants or the poultry will add biological diversity to the soil as well. So yeah, activate soil biology. You can apply nutrients that way. Any purchased feed can actually become the fertilizer for your vegetables the next year. And they're a great way to mow and manage cover crops without using machines. And there's economic benefit to having animals. The diversified markets and revenue, and customers love them. Yeah, I think that's a really undervalued economic benefit of having animals on the farm. If you're trying to have like a farm store or customer appeal on your farm, having some baby animals there will like bring the masses. So we used to do sheep. I didn't have quite the acreage to make it feel worth it. We could fit about 6 sheep on our farm, which felt like a lot of management for diffused over very few animals. But when we had them, it was great to rotate them through the cover crop, mow it down in the fall. Typically, we'll rotate them just in the fall cover crop so that we fulfill the waiting period for organic manure application, which is 120 days for root crops. You can't harvest a root crop less than 120 days after you put manure on the field, even if they put it there themselves. So we get around that by having that waiting period be the winter when we can't harvest anything anyway. We also, we rotate the layers through the fields, and we've planted fruit trees throughout the pasture. That's another sort of stacking of functions, because the layers, I don't know if you can see that picture, but they're all hanging out in the shade of their shelter. As the fruit trees mature, there'll be that much more shade. The grass will actually grow better. The chickens will eat the drops, so it'll be sanitation for the orchard. And it's just, kind of stacking of functions that benefits all the different enterprises. So we don't directly integrate the layers with the vegetable production because they're such vigorous scratchers. It would do away with the no-till. They would basically till the beds. But we do run the turkeys over it because they're less vigorous scratchers. They're much better grazers. So this is winter rye and crimson clover before, during, and after the turkeys have grazed it. And so then this regrows, sucks up all that fertility that the turkeys put down, And all of that goodness is right there for the next crop in the next May, June. And then the turkeys go back out to the perimeter pasture. So basically it's like the wheel, and then we have little spokes into plots. Whatever plots have cover crop, we can bump the animals into those as they make their way around the farm. Here's again, just last week, this is our fall mix of cover crop, and then the turkeys going onto it. This is like, these are some of my favorite moments on the farm. That's why I'm just putting extra photos in. Just how excited these turkeys are. And I feel like if you could listen to the soil microbes, they would be saying the same thing. So this is next season's fertility, like happening now with the sun and with animals. Feels so good relative to like buying a pallet of fertilizer. Crop planting, I feel like in the interest of time, I might skip that. Is that all right? Y'all know how to crop plan. Yeah, I think I'm gonna skip it because I think it's probably not anything you haven't seen before. And it can be on the, I'm happy to share this slideshow too. But I guess the one thing I'll mention is, one thing you normally don't talk about in crop planting is the compatibility of successive crops. So like in terms of spacing and bed prep needs, which becomes much more of an issue when you're not tilling, because you don't just get to like wipe the slate clean between every crop. So here's, I don't know how well you can see that, but we do salad green successions, and we just flail mow and tarp between them. And then you have the stubble here of the arugula, and then we just offset the next seeding to go between the stubble. So kind of thinking ahead with some of that stuff, because if you're following something that had 3 rows in a bed with something else that had 3 rows in a bed, you're going to be trying to plant right on top of that stubble. But if you can follow it with something that has 2 rows or something that has 4 rows, then you can stagger those rows, and those like big like broccoli stumps won't be where you're trying to like claw through the soil to plant the next crop. So thinking about those combinations is worthwhile. This is how we do our crop plan on online spreadsheets. I use those for basically all our farm planning because I find it fosters transparency. I share it with the entire crew. So anybody can log on and see the crop plan, see the harvest plan. We have another sort of plan for the week document. And then it also means it's backed up automatically in the cloud, and you can log in from multiple computers, and it's always the same thing. So yeah, I really love online spreadsheets as much as I don't love technology. And so yeah, basically set it up so that there's a row for each bed and a column for each week of the season, and then color code crops according to family. And then I print this out as well on a big board in the barn. So we have basically every bed is mapped out for every week of the season the winter before. So anybody on the crew can just be like, see exactly what's happening where. There's no like, wait, where are we transplanting this? Or like, you know, it's all figured out beforehand. This is a window into my like type A, whatever, neurosis. But I find that I can like take my time in the winter and like really plan it out, and I'm not making decisions hastily like I would during the season. And then everybody can just kind of sit back and relax about what's going where. And then I can really think about long-term rotation too. Not just like this crop needs a place right now to go in the ground. So this is the example of one plot. We have 16 plots. So there's, you know, the entire crop plan is 16 of those, and then they all get rotated. Since all the plots are the same size, the next year is very simple. You just rotate them around. So what this looks like in the field, I don't know if you can read this, but we did cherry tomatoes and plum tomatoes down the center, and then carrots down the shoulders with sweet Elise
suideolisum in between each tomato plant. So yeah, the crop plan gets more exciting when you start multi-cropping, because it's actually, I said it was 1 row per bed. It's actually 2 rows per bed, because we have 2 crops in each bed. In this case, we have 3, but I wrote the suideolisum like up there in the tomato line. So that's what it looks like in reality. Anyway, you see talking about the layers and trying to maximize soil coverage. Tomatoes down the center, the suideolisum kind of fills out in between the plants. Suideolisum has a very shallow root system, so it doesn't really compete much, but it does kind of cover the soil, and it flowers all season long and feeds the beneficial insects, especially the braconid wasp, which happens to be the wasp that parasitizes tomato hornworms. So it feels like a nice little package with the tomatoes.
Is that setting seed?
Yes, that is setting seed. And I talked to some homesteading friends who grow suideolisum, and they say, yeah, it sets seed, but it never gets out of control. So I'm actually kind of hoping to have a controlled like reseeding of it on its own, because it's so unassuming. Like, it really doesn't compete. Like, I could just like pull out an entire plant and the roots would be like that. So I'm kind of hoping it'll just come up as an understory under future crops as well. And I think it's so easy to kill that we could just hoe it real quick if it got out of hand. Stay tuned on that, we'll see. But yeah, then beets on the shoulder. We already got a crop of carrots out of here. They've come out and the beets went in. So yeah, in past years, I've just only done tomatoes right down the middle and just mulched the beds. And I got to thinking, like, well, that's not really like how nature would do it, right? Why waste all that understory space when there are crops that, you know, might actually appreciate a little bit of shading in the heat of summer, and grow just fine. So yeah, multi-cropping. These are kind of like big ways I think about it. Start with your large or slow-growing plants. Make a list of those. Then you have your small or fast-growing plants, and those are kind of natural pairings. Because yeah, often when you have a large but slow-growing plant, you need to give it all this space in the beginning, but it doesn't need all that space when it's yay big. So in the meantime, you can get a quick crop of something else around the edges, and then that crop can come out before the bigger crop needs the extra space. Another thing to really think about with multi-cropping, what actually inspired me to do it, was learning about mycorrhizal fungus, and that not all plants form mycorrhizal connections. Who here knows about mycorrhizal fungus? Cool, maybe like half. All right, so real quick, myco means fungus, rhizo means root. It's basically fungus of the root. It's fungus that forms a symbiotic relationship with the roots of plants, and extends their root network by like hundreds of times. I've heard up to 100 times. I've also heard up to 1,000 times. More surface area, more contact with the soil, because the fungus actually like inserts itself into the cell walls of the plant root, and then extends the mycelial network, little like hairy hyphae, out from that. Talk about like holistic thinking and no boundaries between organisms. Like on a cellular level, they're joined in the root, and that fungus then extends the soil contact. So that's more like nutrient uptake. That's more water uptake, and it's also been shown to increase disease resistance in major ways. And it's also been shown to actually speed up the development of the plant. So you'll get tomatoes earlier than you would, which all of this is kind of mind-blowing. If you believe that magic is the inexplicable, like this is magical stuff, because mycorrhizal fungus also forms a communication network with other plants and other species, like unrelated species. Like it'll tap into one root and it'll tap into the other, and then
tap into each other, and those plants will actually communicate via chemical signals. So if one is getting attacked by a pest, it'll exude a certain chemical that will get communicated to the other plant, and it will flower in a different way or secrete a different sugar that will attract the natural predator of that pest that's attacking that first plant. Like this has been shown. It's also been shown, especially active in forests. They've inserted radioactive isotopes into a tree, and it's shown up in a tree of a different species miles away. Like that actual, atom, those atoms have traveled through the mycorrhizal network. So this is all amazing stuff, and why am I even talking about it? Because this applies to vegetables too. This is over 90% of all terrestrial plants. Some even say over 95%. So there are certain vegetables, however, that do not form mycorrhizal connections. Of that 5 or 10% that don't, actually a lot of the common vegetables we grow do not. So brassicas are one of them. Anything in the mustard family does not form mycorrhizal connections. Anything in the beet family also doesn't. Those are two of the big vegetable families that we grow. Then there's a smattering of other families, like the buckwheat, dock, rhubarb family. You can go to this website for a complete list. But the brassica and the beet family are kind of the main two that don't form mycorrhizal connections. And mycorrhizal fungus relies on those root connections to survive. So if we grow a whole plot of just brassicas, like I'm doing here, this is mycorrhizal starvation. There's no host plant for the mycorrhizal network, so it's going to deteriorate, maybe even die. Then the next plant we grow in there that does want to form that connection has to build it from scratch, and can really suffer. So rather than going against nature's model and growing a single species or family of species in a whole plot, we can try to undersow the kale to something that does form a mycorrhizal connection. It can kind of sustain that population in the understory so that it's there for the next crop. So this is this looks like a tropical palm forest, but it's the kale, the purple kale with we direct seeded parsley underneath it as an undersown crop to support the mycorrhizal network. And it's actually gone really well. We could have even harvested it, but we had plenty of parsley. But here it is again with the kale a little bit younger. I don't know if you can see it there, but there's parsley underneath that. And the trick to this, it worked really well. I thought of parsley just because I wanted some crop that wasn't going to get out of control, wasn't going to set seed, and wasn't going to overwinter. So I couldn't think of any cover crops that would do that, because white clover is what a lot of people use, but that is a perennial and it takes over, and then we'd have to till or target or something. So I figured parsley being a biennial, it's not going to set seed. It doesn't survive a main winter, and it's pretty low growing. So that seemed to be a good fit, and it turned out to work pretty well. The key to it was waiting to direct seed it until just before the kale canopy closed. So the last minute that you can still push the seeder, that's when we did it, because I think if you seeded it with the kale, it might start to compete, or it might start to shift. You don't want the fungal network to be too strong, since the kale can't tap into it, so your main crop might suffer if you have just this really robust fungal soil. Your parsley's gonna do awesome, but your kale might suffer. So it's a balance of getting that kale established first before the parsley takes off. Again, lettuce forms mycorrhizal connections, so we put lettuce in between the Brussels sprouts. This is, again, into rye, unmowed, just knocked down and tarped. Brussels sprouts are a great example of a slow-growing but big crop. So they don't need all that space in the early summer. You can get a crop of lettuce harvested out of there by the time the Brussels want to spread out more. Here we go, some more multi-crop examples. This is in our high tunnel, the shoulders of the tomatoes planted to celery, shoulders of the cucumbers to Hakurei turnips and bok choy, which normally don't do very well in the summer, but being in the shade of that much cucumber plant, they actually did okay. Still not great because it was a little warm in there for it, but at least it was something growing on the shoulders too, feeding the soil. This carrots, this is our ginger high tunnel, but the ginger takes a really long time to sprout. So we grew a crop of carrots in the meantime after planting the ginger. We planted the bed to carrots. Since carrots can just pull right out without, and then are fully removed and don't disturb the soil much, then the ginger was taking off. So in this picture, the carrots are about ready to come out and the ginger is like that big, kind of poking up through it. So that worked out really well. This is onions with radishes in between rows. This is early in the summer, carrots on the shoulders of the tomato beds. So it means we're able to plant, like the tomato bed, we normally don't plant until June, but we can plant that bed in April. It can be growing a crop, it can be photosynthesizing, and we just leave that middle channel open so that the tomatoes can go in there before the carrots even come out. Snap peas with spinach on the shoulders. Spinach, being in the beet family, doesn't form mycorrhizal connections. So growing with the peas kind of covers those bases. And yeah, the peas did really well. I did not see any negative side effect of doing that. I think if anything, it was just feeding the soil microbes all the more. Sweet peppers are another example of they get big, but they grow slow. Even slower than the Brussels. So we plant the chicories, endive, escarole, because those take a little bit longer than lettuce. So that timing is just right for us, that as soon as the peppers start to need more space, that endive and escarole is ready to harvest and comes out. And it means that endive and escarole can go in first thing in the spring, get something in that bed, rather than like waiting with it just mulched until the peppers are ready. This is spinach and celery, spinach and lettuce heads. We added some grape beds this year. We're putting like grapes down some beds just for fun, and but we're going to keep growing on those beds, keep growing vegetables underneath them, as long as it works. So this is the trio of grapes, carrots, and radishes. Uncommon mix. Then we did a lot of experimenting with lettuce heads and carrots, because we plant those every week in about the same rate. So I was like, if we could somehow integrate those two, and some of it worked really well, and the timing is hard though, because if you plant one a little too late, it doesn't have time to establish well before it gets shaded out by the other. So yeah, that was mixed results on that, but those pictures worked. I didn't put the pictures of the ones that didn't work. Blasting through here, beneficial plantings. This is my newest geek out pleasure. Just designing hedgerows and perennial beds. But they can be any beneficial plant, whether you call it hedgerows, field borders, flowering cover crops, flowering cash crops, perennial gardens, etc. It doesn't have to fit a certain box to be a beneficial planting. By beneficial, I guess that's referencing the beneficial insects that you will be attracting. I would even argue the beneficial microbes that you'll be feeding underground. So perennial diversity can act as a reserve, a sort of bank for soil organisms, whether that's your mycelial network or just other organisms that are going to thrive with perennial roots in the ground, much more so than they will with annuals that have kind of breaks in their life cycle, because you have, transitioning between crops, you always have a little bit of time where there's not a lot of roots in the ground. So yeah, these beds can act as sort of a microbial bank that can then repopulate the vegetable fields next to it as those practices rotate through. It's natural pest control, pollinator food, and habitat. It can be economic diversity. You can harvest berries, fruit, herbs, flowers, medicinals out of the hedgerows. There's no reason they can't be cash crops as well. And they're beautiful, and they make people happy. And what's calculate the value of that? there is definite economic value in that, in a happy crew, in customers who want to come to the farm. It's hard to put a number on it, but that should somehow show up in your bottom line, but it doesn't. So yeah, there's all these benefits to hedgerows and plantings. This is our pick your own flower garden for CSA members, which is also just this huge reserve of pollinator food and habitat. This is the flowering cover crop, whether it's buckwheat or other crops of flower. We let cilantro and dill go to seed. We harvest it for herbs, but then we let it go to seed, and anything in the Apiaceae family is really attractive to beneficial insects. And then we actually let them reseed themselves. I found there's no way to get an earlier crop than to let it self-seed for the next season. And then we can just kind of thin the plants whole a little bit to thin them rather than buy seed and plant them and all that. Also, we don't mow unnecessarily, so we'll actually build in extra time in the crop plan for especially plants in the mustard family to go to seed, or not to go to seed, but go to flower. Mow them before they go to seed, so we're not creating weeds. So like arugula mustard mix, I think this was even bok choy that we just didn't harvest all of, just letting that go to flower. Those flowers are feeding the insects. Often that little bit of extra time is a lot less work than like scheduling a whole another planting for just as a beneficial bit. So yeah, mustard, cilantro, dill, those are kind of easy ones to just let flower. Yeah, undersowing with sweet alyssum. I kind of went big with that this year and I love it. That's like a really easy one to just, because it's not really competitive, it's not going to outcompete much, and it flowers all season long. And yeah, you just see lots of little insects on there, all the little tiny wasps. So yeah, we put that in the onions, the garlic, the tomatoes, just in random flower beds around the farm. We transplanted them. The seed is cheap though, you can direct seed them, and now I'm kind of hoping they'll be self-seeding. Nasturtia in the greenhouse around tomatoes. I've also heard that nasturtia are pretty good at repelling certain pests, like cucumber beetles. It's anecdotal, so I don't know, but it's worth a try. We also sell the nasturtia flowers, put it on our salad mixes, which tickles people. Then perennial herb gardens. Have direct economic value for culinary herbs, but all those herbs flower and attract a lot of great insects too. We also planted the fruit trees throughout the pasture. We planted some beneficial plants around the base. Just trying to get as much diversity and flowering goodness as possible. Any little nook and cranny on the farm, we have a pretty small farm. We're maxed out, so any little nook and cranny just becomes this little like flower garden, which just creates a beautiful place and lots of habitat. It's not just beautiful; it's also like this is our pest control. This is our revenue. And then just leaving certain areas unmowed and wild, and nature will choose her custom selection of wildflowers for that area. So yeah, again, this is my sheet mulched area that people have to walk through to get to the barn. Just like it's just a lovely place for people from suburbia used to like the strip malls and come to the farm, and it's like a breath of fresh air. So then we have intentional beneficial beds between each plot. But yeah, lots of different species planted there. The goal is to provide plants with overlapping bloom periods from early spring right through late fall. That way there's no break in the food supply for any of the insects. They have constant, you have constant food supply, then your populations will increase. So yeah, and to the extent that they can be native, chances are they'll attract more beneficial insects. Those are the insects that have co-evolved with the native plants. And then not just food, but also habitat. So putting in some native bunching grasses for overwintering habitat is important too. And most importantly, like, don't spray. Even the organic pesticides. Remember, the goal is to increase the diversity and the life on the farm. So by spraying, we're going backwards, and we're actually by killing those pests, we're breaking the life cycle of the predators that depend on those pests, right? Because those pests are food for predatory insects, and they're also reproduction sites, host organisms for reproduction. So if we're spraying and just constantly killing all of flea beetles or what have you, we're not just killing the flea beetles. It's holistic thinking. We're all in this together. So you start chipping away at this whole, like, it's going to be a cascading effect. So as much as you can, try not to spray. And we have some pests on the farm, but they're held in check. They're in balance with their natural predators, and that's a good thing, I think. You don't want to wipe the slate clean of any life. My personal opinion. I know that's hard when you're losing a crop, so maybe there are times to make exceptions. But for the most part, I've been able to stick with this, and we're getting away from even using row cover on a lot of crops. We did summer bok choy, summer salad turnips with no row cover, summer arugula. And yeah, sometimes it doesn't quite work, or it's a little lacy, but this year, we really had very low flea beetle pressure. Yeah, I'm gonna skip that one. So here are some shrubs for the hedgerow. You can look at these later. You kind of have to decide how big a hedgerow you want, how wide. In general, shrubs will be about as wide as they are tall. So if you see the height listed, that's going to be about how wide they'll be. So if you're going to dedicate, 15 feet for a hedgerow, you can go with the bigger ones. If you want to squeeze in more like 5 or 6 feet wide, there's the list of smaller ones. Almost all of these are native to the Northeast, but I think also to most of the Eastern Seaboard. So hopefully they're relevant to y'all as well. And a lot of these are cash crops, so we don't need to think of them as just for insects. It's for everyone. These are herbaceous perennials, so non-woody perennials. They die back above ground, but the roots stay alive. They regrow from the roots. And this is from bloom period, early to late. And I tried to take out the New England specific species, so I just stuck with the genuses. So you can look up, find the species that are native to your area. And not all of them are native. I think daffodils and crocuses might not be, but they are some of the early ones for us that feed those first kind of groggy morning insects that come out in the spring. And then native grasses, big blue stem, little blue stem. Yeah, you can take a look at that list. Like I said, I've been geeking out on this for the last year. I'm pretty excited. We have a lot of these growing on the farm, and I'm actually hoping to start sort of a nursery side of the business that sells these and tries to spread the good life around to our neighbors too. I'm writing a book, and it's coming out next September, so almost a year from now. I'm really bad at marketing myself, but maybe look at the pictures, don't read it too closely. But yeah, that's coming out. I think they're still working on the title, but it's something like no-till market gardening. If you want all this in book form. You can also, I've been trying to keep up with the Instagram thing, so if you want to follow us, I imagine that's how a lot of you found this in the first place, but at Frith Farm is our handle. Is that what you call it? Handle. Frith Farm, Frith. So yeah, results. This is working for us. Not to say you do this exact thing and it'll work for everyone, but this is working for us.
And I think a lot about like what is good farming. And if we had more time, I'd love to like ask you guys what is good farming. But we don't have time, so I'll just give you my answer. So I think it's both ecologically and socially enriching. I used to say economically enriching as well, but I think it doesn't need to be enriching. I think it just needs to be sustainable economically. But I think it should be ecologically and socially enriching. We should be building soil, adding value, and strength to ecosystems, building community, building relationships, and also making a living in today's world that feels sustainable. So that's the goal in all this. So talking a little bit about the economics, I feel like we've reached that point of sustainability, able to make a good living and also reinvest pretty significantly in the farm each year. So just looking at this, these are our top crops. I think some people like getting into the line by line items here. So carrots, this is last year. We brought in $32,000 from carrots. Remember, we're on 2.5 acres, all just humans playing in the dirt. So this kind of blows my mind every time I add everything up. So that's about 12% of our total revenue. We planted 50 beds of carrots. So the revenue per bed is like $600 some, but that bed for carrots in our season, that's only half of the season. We can get a whole nother crop. So I multiply that by half, or divide it by half, so multiply it by 2. So the revenue per bed season for growing carrots is like $1,282. So you can start to see why you don't need a lot of space to make a living, right? That's one bed. We have about 200 some beds. So here are the next crops. We've got tomatoes, garlic. You can look at all this later, I guess. But yeah, when you add all that up, our revenue and profit per acre, this kind of tells the history of the farm. The first year I grew on 1 acre. We brought in $40,000 in revenue, which felt like a huge success, but our profit was negative $20,000 because there's so many costs of starting a farm. And yeah, so then the next year we doubled the revenue, but broke even. Like that was like zero profit. But that was a little more hopeful. And then in the third year was the first time I started to actually think that this might work. We brought in $124,000, and $40,000 of that was profit. When I say profit, this isn't like me taking the profit and then going on vacation. This is just like reinvesting in the farm. I've reinvested everything that the farm has earned. At some point, maybe I should think about retirement or something, but I guess the farm is where I hope to grow old and die. So then by last year, we actually grew a little over 3 acres. We've gotten that smaller this year, brought over 300,000, and almost a third of that was the profit margin. So it is working for us. Just in terms of like, well, can this work for anybody, or like, I think it can, given the right location and the right variables. If you get an FSA loan through the Farm Service Agency, USDA, they give up to $300,000. Current rate is 3.25%. Just look at that. So your payments on that, your monthly payments are a little over $1,100 or $13,500 a year. That's your mortgage payment on a $300,000 loan. I borrowed $180,000 to start the farm. $13,000 a year when your profit is $40,000 to $90,000. Like it pans out. Not to say, I'm in a really lucky location, sort of good demographics, people interested in local food. But the whole greater metropolitan area I'm in is still like under 100,000 people. So it's not, I think everybody eats. Everybody wants to put good food in their body. They might have different interpretations of what that is, but yeah, I think it's possible to make this kind of small scale no-till human farming work. same rate as our soil organic matter over the years. Causation, correlation, I don't know.
We should just thank Daniel for being here and